It can hardly be a coincidence that no language on Earth has ever produced the expression, as pretty as an airport. Airports are ugly. Some are very ugly. Some attain a degree of ugliness that can only be the result of a special effort. This ugliness arises because airports are full of people who are tired, cross, and have just discovered that their luggage has landed in Murmansk. Murmansk Airport is the only known exception to this otherwise infallible rule. And architects have on the whole tried to reflect this in their designs. They have sought to highlight the tiredness and crossness motif with brutal shapes and nerve-jangling colors to make effortless the business of separating the traveler forever from his or her luggage or loved ones, to confuse the traveler with arrows that appear to point at the windows, distant tie racks, or the current position of Ursa Minor in the night sky, and, wherever possible, to expose the plumbing on the grounds that it is functional, and conceal the location of the departure gates, presumably on the grounds that they are not. Caught in the middle of a sea of hazy light and a sea of hazy noise, Kate Schechter stood and doubted. All the way out of London to Heathrow she had suffered from doubt. She was not a superstitious person, or even a religious person. She was simply someone who was not at all sure she should be flying to Norway. But she was finding it increasingly easy to believe that God, if there was a God, and if it was remotely possible that any godlike being who could order the disposition of particles at the creation of the universe would also be interested in directing the traffic on the M4, did not want her to fly to Norway either. All the trouble with the tickets, finding a next-door neighbor to look after the cat, then finding the cat so it could be looked after by the next-door neighbor, the sudden leak in the roof, the missing wallet, the weather, the unexpected death of the next-door neighbor, the pregnancy of the cat, it all had the semblance of an orchestrated campaign of obstruction, which had begun to assume godlike proportions. Even the taxi driver, when she had eventually found a taxi, had said, "Norway? What do you want to go there for?" And when she hadn't instantly said, "The Aurora Borealis," or "Fjords," but had looked doubtful for a moment and bitten her lip, he had said, "I know, I bet it's some bloke dragging you out there. Tell you what, tell him to stuff it, go to Tenerife." There was an idea. Tenerife. Or even, she dared to think for a fleeting second, home. She had stared dumbly out of the taxi window at the angry tangles of traffic, and thought that however cold and miserable the weather was here, that was nothing to what it would be like in Norway. Or indeed, at home. Home would be about as icebound as Norway right now, icebound and punctuated with geysers of steam bursting out of the ground, catching in the frigid air, and dissipating between the glacial cliff faces of 6th Avenue. A quick glance at the itinerary Kate had pursued in the course of her 30 years would reveal her without any doubt to be a New Yorker. Although she had lived in the city very little, most of her life had been spent at a constant distance from it. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Europe, and a period of distracted wandering around South America 5 years ago, following the loss of her newly married husband, Luke, in a New York taxi-hailing accident. She enjoyed the notion that New York was home, and that she missed it. But in fact, the only thing she really missed was pizza. And not just any old pizza, but the sort of pizza they brought to your door if you phoned them up and asked them to. That was the only real pizza. Pizza that you had to go out and sit at a table staring at red paper napkins for wasn't real pizza, however much extra pepperoni and anchovy they put on it. London was the place she liked living in most. Part, of course, of the pizza problem, which drove her crazy. Why would no one deliver pizza? Why did no one understand that it was fundamental to the whole nature of pizza that it arrived at your front door in a hot cardboard box, that you slithered it out of greaseproof paper and ate it in folded slices in front of the TV? What was the fundamental flaw in the stupid, stuck-up, sluggardly English that they couldn't grasp this simple principle? For some odd reason, it was the one frustration she could never learn simply to live with and accept. And about once a month or so, she would get very depressed, phone a pizza restaurant, order the biggest, most lavish pizza she could describe, pizza with an extra pizza on it, essentially, and then, sweetly, ask them to deliver it. To what? Deliver. Let me give you the address. I don't understand. Aren't you going to come and pick it up? No. Aren't you going to deliver? My address? We don't do that, miss. Don't do what? Deliver. You don't deliver? Am I hearing you correctly? The exchange would quickly degenerate into an ugly slanging match which would leave her feeling drained and shaky, but much, much better the following morning. In all other respects, she was one of the most sweet-natured people you could hope to meet. But today was testing her to the limit. There had been terrible traffic jams on the motorway, and when the distant flash of blue lights made it clear that the cause was an accident somewhere ahead of them, Kate had become more tense and had stared fixedly out of the other window as eventually they had crawled past it. The taxi driver had been bad-tempered when at last he had dropped her off because she didn't have the right money, and there was a lot of disgruntled hunting through tight trouser pockets before he was eventually able to find change for her. The atmosphere was heavy and thundery, and now, standing in the middle of the main check-in concourse at Terminal 2, Heathrow Airport, she could not find the check-in desk for her flight to Oslo. She stood very still for a moment, breathing calmly and deeply, and trying not to think of Jean-Philippe. Jean-Philippe was, as the taxi driver had correctly guessed, the reason why she was going to Norway, which was also the reason why she was convinced that Norway was not at all a good place for her to go. Thinking of him therefore made her head oscillate, and it seemed best not to think about him at all, but simply to go to Norway as if that was where she happened to be going anyway. She would then be terribly surprised to bump into him at whatever hotel it was he had written on the card that was tucked into the side pocket of her handbag. In fact, she would be surprised to find him there anyway. What she would be much more likely to find was a message from him saying that he had been unexpectedly called away to Guatemala, Seoul, or Tenerife, and that he would call her from there. Jean-Philippe was the most continually absent person she had ever met. In this, he was the culmination of a series. Since she had lost Luke to the great yellow Chevrolet, she had been oddly dependent on the rather vacant emotions that a succession of self-absorbed men had inspired in her. She tried to shut all this out of her mind, and even shut her eyes for a second. She wished that when she opened them again, there would be a sign in front of her saying, "This way for Norway," which she could simply follow without needing to think about it or anything else ever again. This, she reflected, in a continuation of her earlier train of thought, was presumably how religions got started, and must be the reason why so many sects hang around airports looking for converts. They know that people there are at their most vulnerable and perplexed, and ready to accept any kind of guidance. Kate opened her eyes again, and was of course disappointed. But then, a second or two later, there was a momentary parting in a long, surging wave of crossed Germans in inexplicable yellow polo shirts, and through it she had a brief glimpse of the check-in desk for Oslo. Lugging her garment bag onto her shoulder, she made her way towards it. There was just one other person before her in the line at the desk, and he, it turned out, was having trouble, or perhaps making it. He was a large man, impressively large and well-built, even expertly built. But he was also definitely odd-looking in a way that Kate couldn't quite deal with. She couldn't even say what it was that was odd about him, only that she was immediately inclined not to include him on her list of things to think about at the moment. She remembered reading an article which had explained that the central processing unit of the human brain only had 7 memory registers, which meant that if you had 7 things in your mind at the same time, and then thought of something else, one of the other 7 would instantly drop out. In quick succession, she thought about whether or not she was likely to catch the plane, about whether it was just her imagination that the day was a particularly bloody one, about airline staff who smile charmingly and are breathtakingly rude, about duty-free shops which are able to charge much lower prices than ordinary shops, but mysteriously don't, about whether or not she felt a magazine article about airports coming on, which might help her pay for the trip, about whether her garment bag would hurt less on her other shoulder, and finally, in spite of all her intentions to the contrary, about Jean-Philippe, who was another set of at least 7 subtopics all to himself. The man standing arguing in front of her popped right out of her mind. It was only the announcement on the airport tannoy of the last call for her flight to Oslo which forced her attention back to the situation in front of her. The large man was making trouble about the fact that he hadn't been given a first-class seat reservation. It had just transpired that the reason for this was that he didn't in fact have a first-class ticket. Kate's spirits sank to the very bottom of her being and began to prowl around there, making a low growling noise. It now transpired that the man in front of her didn't actually have a ticket at all, and the argument then began to range freely and angrily over such topics as the physical appearance of the airline check-in girl, her qualities as a person, theories about her ancestors, speculations as to what surprises the future might have in store for her, and the airline for which she worked, and finally lit by chance on the happy subject of the man's credit card. He didn't have one. Further discussions ensued and had to do with checks and why the airline did not accept them. Kate took a long, slow, murderous look at her watch. Excuse me, she said, interrupting transactions. Is this going to take long? I have to catch the Oslo flight. I'm just dealing with this gentleman, said the girl. I'll be with you in just 1 second. Kate nodded and politely allowed just 1 second to go by. It's just that the flight's about to leave, she said then. I have one bag, I have my ticket, I have a reservation. It'll take about 30 seconds. I hate to interrupt, but I'd hate even more to miss my flight for the sake of 30 seconds. That's 30 actual seconds, not 30 just 1 seconds, which could keep us here all night. The check-in girl turned the full glare of her lip gloss onto Kate, but before she could speak, the large blonde man looked round, and the effect of his face was a little disconcerting. I, too, he said in a slow, angry, Nordic voice, wish to fly to Oslo. Kate stared at him. He looked thoroughly out of place in an airport, or rather, the airport looked thoroughly out of place around him. Well, she said, the way we're stacked up at the moment, it looks like neither of us is going to make it. Can we just sort this one out? What's the hold-up? The check-in girl smiled her charming dead smile and said, the airline does not accept checks as a matter of company policy. Well, I do, said Kate, slapping down her own credit card. Charge the gentleman's ticket to this, and I'll take a check from him. Okay, she added to the big man, who was looking at her with slow surprise. His eyes were large and blue, and conveyed the impression that they'd looked at a lot of glaciers in their time. They were extraordinarily arrogant, and also muddled. Okay, she repeated briskly. My name is Kate Schechter. That's 2 C's, 2 H's, 2 E's, and also a T, an R, and an S. Provided they're all there, the bank won't be fussy about the order they come in. They never seem to know themselves. The man very slowly inclined his head a little towards her in a rough bow of acknowledgement. He thanked her for her kindness, courtesy, and some Norwegian word that was lost on him. Said that it was a long while since he had encountered anything of the kind, that she was a woman of spirit and some other Norwegian word, and that he was indebted to her. He also added as an afterthought that he had no checkbook. Right, said Kate, determined not to be deflected from her course. She fished in her handbag for a piece of paper, took a pen from the check-in counter, scribbled on the paper, and thrust it at him. That's my address, she said. Send me the money. Hock your fur coat if you have to. Just send it to me, okay? I'm taking a flyer on trusting you. The big man took the scrap of paper, read the few words on it with immense slowness, then folded it with elaborate care and put it into the pocket of his coat. Again, he bowed to her very slightly. Kate suddenly realized that the check-in girl was silently waiting for her pen bag to fill in the credit card form. She pushed it back at her in annoyance, handed over her own ticket, and imposed on herself an icy calm. The airport tannoy announced the departure of their flight. May I see your passports, please? Said the girl unhurriedly. Kate handed hers over, but the big man didn't have one. You what? Exclaimed Kate. The airline girl simply stopped moving at all and stared quietly at a random point on her desk, waiting for someone else to make a move. It wasn't her problem. The man repeated angrily that he didn't have a passport. He shouted it and banged his fist on the counter so hard that it was slightly dented by the force of the blow. Kate picked up her ticket, her passport, and her credit card and hoisted her garment bag up on her shoulder. This is where I get off, she said, and simply walked away. She felt that she had made every effort a human being could possibly be expected to make to catch her plane, but that it was not to be. She would send a message to Jean-Philippe saying that she could not be there, and it would probably sit in a slot next to his message to her, saying why he could not be there either. For once, they would be equally absent. For the time being, she would go and cool off. She set off in search first of a newspaper and then some coffee, and by dint of following the appropriate signs, was unable to locate either. She was then unable to find a working phone from which to send a message, and decided to give up on the airport altogether. Just get out, she told herself, find a taxi, and go back home. She threaded her way back across the check-in concourse, and had almost made it to the exit when she happened to glance back at the check-in desk that had defeated her, and was just in time to see it shoot up through the roof, engulfed in a ball of orange flame. As she lay beneath a pile of rubble, in pain, darkness, and choking dust, trying to find sensation in her limbs, she was at least relieved to be able to think that she hadn't merely been imagining that this was a bad day. So thinking, she passed out. The usual people tried to claim responsibility. First the IRA, then the PLO and the gas board. Even British Nuclear Fuels rushed out a statement to the effect that the situation was completely under control, that it was a 1 in a million chance, that there was hardly any radioactive leakage at all, and that the site of the explosion would make a nice location for a day out with the kids and a picnic, before finally having to admit that it wasn't actually anything to do with them at all. No cause could be found for the explosion. It seemed to have happened spontaneously and of its own free will. Explanations were advanced, but most of these were simply phrases which restated the problem in different words, along the same principles which had given the world metal fatigue. In fact, a very similar phrase was invented to account for the sudden transition of wood, metal, plastic and concrete into an explosive condition, which was non-linear catastrophic structural exasperation. Or to put it another way, as a junior cabinet minister did on television the following night in a phrase which was to haunt the rest of his career, the check-in desk had just got fundamentally fed up with being where it was. As in all such disastrous events, estimates of the casualties varied wildly. They started at 47 dead, 89 seriously injured, went up to 63 dead, 130 injured, and rose as high as 117 dead before the figures started to be revised downward once more. The final figures revealed that once all the people who could be accounted for had been accounted for, in fact no one had been killed at all. A small number of people were in hospital suffering from cuts and bruises and varying degrees of traumatized shock. But that, unless anyone had any information about anybody actually being missing, was that. This was yet another inexplicable aspect to the whole affair. The force of the explosion had been enough to reduce a large part of the front of Terminal 2 to rubble, and yet everyone inside the building had somehow either fallen very luckily, or been shielded from one piece of falling masonry by another, or had the shock of the explosion absorbed by their luggage. All in all, very little luggage had survived at all. There were questions asked in Parliament about this, but not very interesting ones. It was a couple of days before Kate Schechter became aware of any of these things, or indeed of anything at all in the outside world. She passed the time quietly in a world of her own, in which she was surrounded, as far as the eye could see, with old cabin trunks full of past memories, in which she rummaged with great curiosity and sometimes bewilderment. Or at least about a tenth of the cabin trunks were full of vivid and often painful or uncomfortable memories of her past life. The other 9/10 were full of penguins, which surprised her. Insofar as she recognized at all that she was dreaming, she realized that she must be exploring her own subconscious mind. She had heard it said that human beings are supposed only to use about a tenth of their brains, and that no one was very clear what the other 9/10 were for. But she had certainly never heard it suggested that they were used for storing penguins. Gradually the trunks, the memories, and the penguins began to grow indistinct, to become all white and swimmy, then to become like walls that were all white and swimmy, and finally to become walls that were merely white, or rather a yellowish-greenish kind of off-white, and to enclose her in a small room. The room was in semi-darkness. A bedside light was on, but turned down low, and the light from a street lamp found its way between the grey curtains and through sodium patterns on the opposite wall. She became dimly aware of the shadowed shape of her own body lying under the white turned-down sheet and the pale, neat blankets. She stared at it for a nervous while, checking that it looked all right before she tried tentatively to move any part of it. She tried her right hand, and that seemed to be fine. A little stiff and aching, but the fingers all responded, and all seemed to be of the right length and thickness, and to bend in the right places and in the right directions. She panicked briefly when she couldn't immediately locate her left hand, but then she found it lying across her stomach, and nagging at her in some odd way. It took her a second or two of concentration to put together a number of rather disturbing feelings, and realized that there was a needle bandaged into her arm. This shook her quite badly. On the needle there snaked a long, thin, transparent pipe that glistened yellowly in the light from the street lamp, and hung in a gentle curl from a thick plastic bag suspended from a tall metal stand. An array of horrors briefly assailed her in respect of this apparatus, but she peered dimly at the bag and saw the words, "Extra saline." She made herself calm down again and lay quietly for a few moments before continuing her exploration. Her ribcage seemed undamaged, bruised and tender, but there was no sharper pain anywhere to suggest that anything was broken. Her hips and thighs ached and were stiff, but revealed no serious hurt. She flexed the muscles down her right leg and then her left. She rather fancied that her left ankle was sprained. In other words, she told herself, she was perfectly all right. So what was she doing here in what she could tell from the septic colour of the paint was clearly a hospital? She sat up impatiently and immediately rejoined the penguins for an entertaining few minutes. The next time she came round, she treated herself with a little more care and lay quietly, feeling gently nauseous. She poked gingerly at her memory of what had happened. It was dark and blotchy and came at her in thick, greasy waves like the North Sea. Lumpy things jumbled themselves out of it and slowly arranged themselves into a heaving airport. The airport was sour and ached in her head, and in the middle of it, pulsing like a migraine, was the memory of a moment's whirling splurge of light. It became suddenly very clear to her that the check-in concourse of Terminal 2 at Heathrow Airport had been hit by a meteorite. Silhouetted in the flare was the fur-coated figure of a big man who must have caught the full force of it and been reduced instantly to a cloud of atoms that were free to go as they pleased. The thought caused a deep and horrid shudder to go through her. He had been infuriating and arrogant, but she had liked him in an odd way. There had been something oddly noble in his perverse bloody-mindedness. Or maybe, she realized, she liked to think that such perverse bloody-mindedness was noble because it reminded her of herself trying to order pizza to be delivered in an alien, hostile, and non-pizza delivering world. Nobleness is one word for making a fuss about the trivial inevitabilities of life, but there were others. She felt a sudden surge of fear and loneliness, but it quickly ebbed away and left her feeling much more composed, relaxed, and wanting to go to the lavatory. According to her watch, it was shortly after 3 o'clock, and according to everything else, it was night time. She should probably call a nurse and let the world know she had come round. There was a window in the side wall of the room through which she could see a dim corridor, in which stood a stretcher trolley and a tall black oxygen bottle, but which was otherwise empty. Things were very quiet out there. Peering around her in the small room, she saw a white-painted plywood cupboard, a couple of tubular steel and vinyl chairs lurking quietly in the shadows, and a white-painted plywood bedside cabinet which supported a small bowl with a single banana in it. On the other side of the bed stood her drip stand. Set into the wall on that side of the bed was a metal plate with a couple of black knobs and a set of old Bakelite headphones hanging from it, and wound around the tubular side pillar of the bed head was a cable with a bell push attached to it, which she fingered and then decided not to push. She was fine. She could find her own way about. Slowly, a little woozily, she pushed herself up onto her elbows and slid her legs out from under the sheets and onto the floor, which was cold to her feet. She could tell almost immediately that she shouldn't be doing this, because every part of her feet was sending back streams of messages telling her exactly what every tiniest bit of the floor that they touched felt like, as if it was a strange and worrying thing, the like of which they had never encountered before. Nevertheless, she sat on the edge of the bed and made her feet accept the floor as something they were just going to have to get used to. The hospital had put her into a large, baggy, striped thing. It wasn't merely baggy, she decided on examining it more closely. It actually was a bag. A bag of loose blue and white striped cotton. It opened up the back and let in chilly night drafts. Perfunctory sleeves flopped halfway down her arms. She moved her arms around in the light, examining the skin, rubbing it and pinching it, especially around the bandage which held her drip needle in place. Normally her arms are lithe and the skin was firm and supple. Tonight, however, they looked like bits of chickens. Briefly, she smoothed each forearm with her other hand, and then looked up again, purposefully. She reached out and gripped the drip stand, and, because it wobbled slightly less than she did, she was able to use it to pull herself slowly to her feet. She stood there, her tall, slim figure trembling, and after a few seconds she held the drip stand away at a bent arm's length, like a shepherd holding a crook. She had not made it to Norway, but she was at least standing up. The drip stand rolled on 4 small and independently perverse wheels, which behaved like 4 screaming children in the supermarket. But nevertheless, Kate was able to propel it to the door ahead of her. Walking increased her sense of wooziness, but also increased her resolve not to give in to it. She reached the door, opened it, and pushing the drip stand out ahead of her, looked out into the corridor. To her left, the corridor ended in a couple of swing doors with circular porthole windows, which seemed to lead into a larger area, an open ward perhaps. To her right, a number of smaller doors opened off the corridor as it continued on for a short distance before turning a sharp corner. One of those doors would probably be the lavatory. The others? Well, she would find out as she looked for the lavatory. The first 2 were cupboards. The third was slightly bigger and had a chair in it, and therefore probably counted as a room, since most people don't like to sit in cupboards, even nurses, who have to do a lot of things that most people wouldn't like to. It also had a stack of styro beakers, a lot of semi-congealed coffee creamer, and an elderly coffee maker, all sitting on top of a small table together and seeping grimly over a copy of the Evening Standard. Kate picked up the dark, damp paper and tried to reconstruct some of her missing days from it. However, what with her own wobbly condition making it difficult to read, and the droopily stuck-together condition of the newspaper, she was able to glean little more than the fact that no one could really say for certain what had happened. It seemed that no one had been seriously hurt, but that an employee of one of the airlines was still unaccounted for. The incident had now been officially classified as an act of God. Nice one, God, thought Kate. She put down the remains of the paper and closed the door behind her. The next door she tried was another small side ward like her own. There was a bedside table and a single banana in the fruit bowl. The bed was clearly occupied. She pulled the door to quickly, but she did not pull it quickly enough. Unfortunately, something odd had caught her attention, but although she had noticed it, she could not immediately say what it was. She stood there with the door half closed, staring at the floor, knowing that she should not look again, and knowing that she would. Carefully, she eased the door back open again. The room was darkly shadowed and chilly. The chilliness did not give her a good feeling about the occupant of the bed. She listened. The silence didn't sound too good either. It wasn't the silence of healthy, deep sleep. It was the silence of nothing but a little distant traffic noise. She hesitated for a long while, silhouetted in the doorway, looking and listening. She wondered about the sheer bulk of the occupant of the bed, and how cold he was with just a thin blanket pulled over him. Next to the bed was a small, tubular-legged vinyl bucket chair, which was rather overwhelmed by the huge and heavy fur coat draped over it, and Kate thought that the coat should more properly be draped over the bed and its cold occupant. At last, walking as softly and cautiously as she could, she moved into the room and over to the bed. She stood looking down at the face of the big Nordic man. Though cold and though his eyes were shut, his face was frowning slightly as if he was still rather worried about something. It struck Kate as being almost infinitely sad. In life the man had had the air of someone who was beset by huge, if somewhat puzzling, difficulties, and the appearance that he had almost immediately found things beyond this life that were a bother to him as well was miserable to contemplate. She was astonished that he appeared to be so unscathed. His skin was totally unmarked. It was rugged and healthy, or rather had been healthy until very recently. Closer inspection showed a network of fine lines, which suggested that he was older than the mid-30s she had originally assumed. He could even have been a very fit and healthy man in his late 40s. Standing against the wall, by the door, was something unexpected. It was a large Coca-Cola vending machine. It didn't look as if it had been installed there, it wasn't plugged in, and it had a small, neat sticker on it explaining that it was temporarily out of order. It looked as if it had simply been left there inadvertently by someone who was probably even now walking around wondering which room he'd left it in. Its large red and white wavy panel stared glassily into the room and did not explain itself. The only thing the machine communicated to the outside world was that there was a slot into which coins of a variety of denominations might be inserted, and an aperture to which a variety of different cans would be delivered if the machine was working, which it was not. There was also an old sledgehammer leaning against it, which was, in its own way, odd. Faintness began to creep over Kate. The room began to develop a slight spin, and there was some restless rustling in the cabin trunks of her mind. Then she realized that the rustling wasn't simply her imagination. There was a distinct noise in the room, a heavy, beating, scratching noise, a muffled fluttering. The noise rose and fell like the wind, but in her dazed and woozy state, Kate could not at first tell where the noise was coming from. At last, her gaze fell on the curtains. She stared at them with the worried frown of a drunk trying to work out why the door is dancing. The sound was coming from the curtains. She walked uncertainly towards them and pulled them apart. A huge eagle with circles tattooed on its wings was clattering and beating against the window, staring in with great yellow eyes and pecking wildly at the glass. Kate staggered back, turned and tried to heave herself out of the room. At the end of the corridor, the porthole doors swung open and two figures came through them. Hands rushed towards her as she became hopelessly entangled in the drip stand and began slowly to spin towards the floor. She was unconscious as they carefully laid her back in her bed. She was unconscious half an hour later, when a disturbingly short figure in a worryingly long white doctor's coat arrived, wheeled the big man away on a stretcher trolley, and then returned after a few minutes for the Coca-Cola machine. She woke a few hours later with the wintry sun seeping through the window. The day looked very quiet and ordinary, but Kate was still shaking. The same sun later broke in through the upper windows of a house in North London and struck the peacefully sleeping figure of a man. The room in which he slept was large and bedraggled and did not much benefit from the sudden intrusion of light. The sun crept slowly across the bedclothes, as if nervous of what it might find amongst them, slunk down the side of the bed, moved in a rather startled way across some objects it encountered on the floor, toyed nervously with a couple of motes of dust, lit briefly on a stuffed fruit bat hanging in the corner, and fled. This was about as big an appearance as the sun ever put in here, and it lasted for about an hour or so, during which time the sleeping figure scarcely stirred. At 11 o'clock, the phone rang, and still the figure did not respond, any more than it had responded when the phone had rung at 25 to 7 in the morning, again at 20 to 7, again at 10 to 7, and again for 10 minutes continuously starting at 5 to 7, after which it had settled into a long and significant silence, disturbed only by the braying of police sirens in a nearby street at around 9 o'clock, the delivery of a large 18th century dual manual harpsichord at around 9:15, and the collection of same by bailiffs at a little after 10. This was a not uncommon sort of occurrence. The people concerned were accustomed to finding the key under the doormat, and the man in the bed was accustomed to sleeping through it. You would probably not say that he was sleeping the sleep of the just, unless you meant the just asleep, but it was certainly the sleep of someone who was not fooling about when he climbed into bed at night and turned off the light. The room was not a room to elevate the soul. Louis XIV, to pick a name at random, would not have liked it. Would have found it not sunny enough and insufficiently full of mirrors. He would have desired someone to pick up the socks, put the records away, and maybe burn the place down. Michelangelo would have been distressed by its proportions, which were neither lofty nor shaped by any noticeable inner harmony or symmetry, other than that all parts of the room were pretty much equally full of old coffee mugs, shoes, and brimming ashtrays, most of which were now sharing their tasks with each other. The walls were painted in almost precisely that shade of green which Raffaello Sanzio would have bitten off his right hand at the wrist rather than use, and Hercules, on seeing the room, would probably have returned half an hour later armed with a navigable river and a mop. It was, in short, a dump, and was likely to remain so for as long as it remained in the custody of Mr. Sklad, or Dirk, gently, nay, Celi. At last, gently stirred. The sheets and blankets were pulled up tightly round his head, but from somewhere halfway down the length of the bed, a hand slowly emerged from under the bedclothes, and its fingers felt their way in little tapping movements along the floor. Working from experience, they neatly circumvented a bowl of something very nasty that had been sitting there since Michaelmas, and eventually happened upon a half-empty pack of untipped Gauloises and a box of matches. The fingers shook a crumpled white tube free of the pack, seized it and the box of matches, and then started to poke away through the sheets tangled together at the top of the bed, like a magician prodding at a handkerchief from which he intends to release a flock of doves. The cigarette was at last inserted into the hole. The cigarette was lit. For a while the bed itself appeared to be smoking the cigarette in great heaving drags. It coughed long, loud and shudderingly, and then began at last to breathe in a more measured rhythm. In this way, Dirk gently achieved consciousness. He lay there for a while, feeling a terrible sense of worry and guilt about something weighing on his shoulders. He wished he could forget about it, and promptly did. He levered himself out of bed, and a few minutes later padded downstairs. The mail on the doormat consisted of the usual things: a rude letter threatening to take away his American Express card, an invitation to apply for an American Express card, and a few bills of the more hysterical and unrealistic type. He couldn't understand why they kept sending them. The cost of the postage seemed merely to be good money thrown after bad. He shook his head in wonderment at the malevolent incompetence of the world, threw the mail away, entered the kitchen, and approached the fridge with caution. It stood in the corner. The kitchen was large and shrouded in a deep gloom that was not relieved when it turned yellow by the action of switching on the light. Dirk squatted down in front of the fridge and carefully examined the edge of the door. He found what he was looking for. In fact, he found more than he was looking for. Near the bottom of the door, across the narrow gap which separated the door from the main body of the fridge, which held the strip of grey insulating rubber, lay a single human hair. It was stuck there with dried saliva. That he had expected. He had stuck it there himself 3 days earlier, and had checked it on several occasions since then. What he had not expected to find was a second hair. He frowned at it in alarm. A second hair. It was stuck across the gap in the same way as the first one, only this hair was near the top of the fridge door, and he had not put it there. He peered at it closely, and even went so far as to go and open the old shutters on the kitchen windows to let some extra light in upon the scene. The daylight shouldered its way in like a squad of policemen, and did a lot of what's all thising around the room, which, like the bedroom, would have presented anyone of an aesthetic disposition with difficulties. Like most of the rooms in Dirk's house, it was large, looming, and utterly dishevelled. It simply sneered at anyone's attempt to tidy it, sneered at them and brushed them aside like one of the small pile of dead and disheartened flies that lay beneath the window, on top of a pile of old pizza boxes. The light revealed the second hair for what it was, a grey hair at root, dyed a vivid metallic orange. Dirk pursed his lips and thought very deeply. He didn't need to think hard in order to realize who the hair belonged to. There was only one person who regularly entered the kitchen, looking as if her head had been used for extracting metal oxides from industrial waste. But he did have seriously to consider the implications of the discovery that she had been plastering her hair across the door of his fridge. It meant that the silently waged conflict between himself and his cleaning lady had escalated to a new and more frightening level. It was now, Dirk reckoned, fully 3 months since this fridge door had been opened, and each of them was grimly determined not to be the one to open it first. The fridge no longer merely stood there in the corner of the kitchen, it actually lurked. Dirk could quite clearly remember the day on which the thing had started lurking. It was about a week ago, when Dirk had tried a simple subterfuge to trick Alina, the old bat's name was Alina, pronounced to rhyme with cleaner, which was an irony that Dirk now no longer relished, into opening the fridge door. The subterfuge had been deftly deflected, and had nearly rebounded horribly on Dirk. He had resorted to the strategy of going to the local mini-market to buy a few simple groceries. Nothing contentious, a little milk, some eggs, some bacon, a carton or two of chocolate custard, and a simple half-pound of butter. He had left them innocently on top of the fridge, as if to say, "Oh, when you have a moment, perhaps you could pop these inside." When he had returned that evening, his heart bounded to see that they were no longer on top of the fridge. They were gone. They had not merely been moved aside or put on a shelf, they were nowhere to be seen. She must finally have capitulated and put them away, in the fridge, and she would surely have cleaned it out once it was actually open. For the first and only time, his heart swelled with warmth and gratitude towards her, and he was about to fling open the door of the thing in relief and triumph when an eighth sense, at the last count Dirk reckoned he had 11, warned him to be very, very careful, and to consider first where Alina might have put the cleared-out contents of the fridge. A nameless doubt gnawed at his mind as he moved noiselessly towards the garbage bin beneath the sink. Holding his breath, he opened the lid and looked. There, nestling in the folds of the fresh black bin liner, were his eggs, his bacon, his chocolate custard, and his simple half-pound of butter. 2 milk bottles stood rinsed and neatly lined up by the sink, into which their contents had presumably been poured. She had thrown it away. Rather than open the fridge door, she had thrown his food away. He looked round slowly at the grimy, squat, white monolith, and that was the exact moment at which he realized without a shadow of a doubt that his fridge had now begun seriously to lurk. He made himself a stiff black coffee and sat slightly trembling. He had not even looked directly at the sink, but he knew that he must unconsciously have noticed the 2 clean milk bottles there, and some busy part of his mind had been alarmed by them. The next day he had explained all this away to himself. He was becoming needlessly paranoid. It had surely been an innocent or careless mistake on Alina's part. She had probably been brooding distractedly on her son's attack of bronchitis, peevishness, or homosexuality, or whatever it was that regularly prevented her from either turning up or from having any noticeable effect when she did. She was Italian, and probably had absent-mindedly mistaken his food for garbage. But the business with the hair changed all that. It had established beyond all possible doubt that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was under no circumstances going to open the fridge door until he had opened it first, and he was under no circumstances going to open the fridge until she had. Obviously, she had not noticed his hair. Otherwise, it would have been her most effective course simply to pull it off, thus tricking him into thinking she had opened the fridge. He should presumably now remove her hair in the hope of pulling that same trick on her. But even as he sat there, he knew that somehow that wouldn't work, and that they were locked into a tightening spiral of non-fridge opening that would lead them both to madness or perdition. He wondered if he could hire someone to come and open the fridge. No, he was not in a position to hire anybody to do anything. He was not even in a position to pay Alina for the last 3 weeks. The only reason he didn't ask her to leave was that sacking somebody inevitably involved paying them off, and this he was in no position to do. His secretary had finally left him on her own initiative and gone off to do something reprehensible in the travel business. Dirk had attempted to cast scorn on her, preferring monotony of pay over regularity of pay, she had calmly corrected him, over job satisfaction. She had nearly said, "Over what?" But at that moment she realized that if she said that, she would have to listen to his reply, which would be bound to infuriate her into arguing back. It occurred to her for the first time that the only way of escaping was just not to get drawn into these arguments. If she simply did not respond this time, then she was free to leave. She tried it. She felt a sudden freedom. She left. A week later, in much the same mood, she married an airline cabin steward called Smith. Dirk had kicked her desk over, and then had to pick it up himself later, when she didn't come back. The detective business was currently as brisk as the tomb. Nobody, it seemed, wished to have anything detected. Dirk had recently, to make ends meet, taken up doing palmistry and drag on Thursday evenings, but he wasn't comfortable with it. He could have withstood it. The hateful, abject humiliation of it all was something to which he had, in different ways, now become accustomed, and he was quite anonymous in his little tent in the back garden of the pub. He could have withstood it all if he hadn't been so horribly, excruciatingly good at it. It made him break out in a sweat of self-loathing He tried by every means to cheat, to fake, to be deliberately and cynically bad, but whatever fakery he tried to introduce always failed, and he invariably ended up being right. His worst moment had come about as a result of the poor woman from Oxfordshire who had come in to see him one evening. Being in something of a waggish mood, he had suggested to her that she should keep an eye on her husband, who, judging by her marriage line, looked to be a bit of a flighty type. It transpired that her husband was in fact a fighter pilot, and that his plane had been lost in an exercise over the North Sea only a fortnight earlier. Dirk had been flustered by this, and had soothed meaninglessly at her. He was certain, he said, that her husband would be restored to her in the fullness of time, that all will be well, and that all manner of things would be well, and so on. The woman said that she thought this was not very likely, seeing as the world record of staying alive in the North Sea was rather less than an hour, and since no trace of her husband had been found in 2 weeks, it seemed fanciful to imagine that he was anything other than stone dead, and she was trying to get used to the idea. Thank you very much. She said it rather tartly. Dirk had lost all control at this point and started to babble. He said that it was very clear from reading her hands that the great sum of money she had coming to her would be no consolation to her for the loss of her dear, dear husband, but that at least it might comfort her to know that he had gone on to that great something or other in the sky, that he was floating on the fleeciest of white clouds, looking very handsome in his new set of wings, and that he was terribly sorry to be talking such appalling drivel, but she had caught him rather by surprise. Would you care for some tea or some vodka or some soup? The woman demurred. She said she had only wandered into the tent by accident. She had been looking for the lavatories, and what was that about the money? Complete gibberish, Dirk had explained. He was in great difficulties, what with having the falsetto to keep up. I was making it up as I went along, he said. Please allow me to tender my most profound apologies for intruding so clumsily on your private grief, and to escort you to, or rather direct you to the, what I can only in the circumstances call the lavatory, which is out of the tent and on the left. Dirk had been cast down by this encounter, but was then utterly horrified a few days later, when he discovered that the very following morning, the unfortunate woman had learnt that she had won £250,000 on the premium bonds. He spent several hours that night standing on the roof of his house, shaking his fist at the dark sky and shouting, "Stop it!" until a neighbour complained to the police that he couldn't sleep. The police had come round in the screaming squad car and woken up the rest of the neighbourhood as well. Today, this morning, Dirk sat in his kitchen and stared dejectedly at his fridge. The bloody-minded ebullience, which he usually relied on to carry him through the day, had been knocked out of him in its very opening moments by the business with the fridge. His will sat imprisoned in it, locked up by a single hair. What he needed, he thought, was a client. Please God, he thought, if there is a God, any God, bring me a client. Just a simple client. The simpler, the better. Credulous and rich. Someone like that chap yesterday. He tapped his fingers on the table. The problem was that the more credulous the client, the more Dirk fell foul at the end of his own better nature, which was constantly rearing up and embarrassing him at the most inopportune moments. Dirk frequently threatened to hurl his better nature to the ground and kneel on its windpipe. But it usually managed to get the better of him by dressing itself up as guilt and self-loathing, in which guise it could throw him right out of the ring. Credulous and rich, just so that he could pay off some, perhaps even just one, of the more prominent and sensational bills. He lit a cigarette. Smoke curled upwards in the morning light and attached itself to the ceiling. Like that chap yesterday. He paused. The chap yesterday. The world held its breath. Quietly and gently there settled on him the knowledge that something, somewhere, was ghastly. Something was terribly wrong. There was a disaster hanging silently in the air around him, waiting for him to notice it. His knees tingled. What he needed, he had been thinking, was a client. He'd been thinking that as a matter of habit. It was what he always thought at this time of the morning. What he had forgotten was that he had one. He stared wildly at his watch. Nearly 11:30. He shook his head to try and clear the silent ringing between his ears, then made a hysterical lunge for his hat and his great leather coat that hung behind the door. 15 seconds later, he left the house, 5 hours late, but moving fast. A minute or two later, Dirk paused to consider his best strategy. Rather than arrive 5 hours late and flustered, it would be better all round if he were to arrive 5 hours and a few extra minutes late, but triumphantly in command. "Pray God I am not too soon," would be a good opening line as he swept in, but it needed a good follow-through as well, and he wasn't sure what it should be. Perhaps it would save time if he went back to get his car, but then again it was only a short distance, and he had a tremendous propensity for getting lost when driving. This was largely because of his method of Zen and navigation, which was simply to find any car that looked as if it knew where it was going and follow it. The results were more often surprising than successful, but he felt it was worth it for the sake of the few occasions when it was both. Furthermore, he was not at all certain that his car was working. It was an elderly Jaguar, built at that very special time in the company's history when they were making cars that had to stop for repairs more often than they needed to stop for petrol, and frequently needed to stop for months between outings. He was, however, certain, now that he came to think about it, that the car didn't have any petrol, and furthermore he did not have any cash or valid plastic to enable him to fill it up. He abandoned that line of thought as wholly fruitless. He stopped to buy a newspaper while he thought things over. The clock in the newsagent said 11:35. Damn, damn, damn. He toyed with the idea of simply dropping the case, just walking away and forgetting about it. Having some lunch. The whole thing was fraught with difficulties in any event. Or rather, it was fraught with one particular difficulty, which was that of keeping a straight face. The whole thing was complete and utter nonsense. The client was clearly loopy, and Dirk would not have considered taking the case except for one very important thing. £300 a day plus expenses. The client had agreed to it just like that, and when Dirk had started his usual speech, to the effect that his methods, involving as they did the fundamental interconnectedness of all things, often led to expenses that might appear to the untutored eye to be somewhat tangential to the matter in hand, the client had simply waved the matter aside as trifling. Dirk liked that in the client. The only thing the client had insisted upon, in the midst of this almost superhuman fit of reasonableness, was that Dirk had to be there, absolutely had to be there, ready, functioning and alert without fail, without even the mere smidgen of an inkling of failure, at 6:30 in the morning, absolute. Well, he was just going to have to see reason about that as well. 6:30 was clearly a preposterous time. Nobody got murdered before lunch. But nobody. People weren't up to it. You needed a good lunch to get both the blood sugar and bloodlust levels up. Dirk had the figures to prove it. Did he, Anstey, the client's name was Anstey, an odd, intense man in his mid-30s with staring eyes, a narrow yellow tie and one of the big houses in Lupton Road. Dirk hadn't actually liked him very much and thought he looked as if he was trying to swallow a fish. Did he know that 67% of all known murderers who expressed a preference had had liver and bacon for lunch? And that another 22% had been torn between either a prawn biryani or an omelette? That dispensed of 89% of the threat of the stroke. And by the time you had further discounted the salad eaters and the turkey and ham sandwich munchers, and started to look at the number of people who wouldn't contemplate such a course of action without any lunch at all, then you were well into the realms of negligibility and bordering on fantasy. After 2:30, but nearer to 3 o'clock, was when you had to start being on your guard, seriously, even on good days. Even when you weren't receiving death threats from strange, gigantic men with green eyes, you had to watch people like a hawk after the lunching hour. The really dangerous time was after 4 o'clock-ish, when the streets began to fill up with marauding packs of publishers and agents maddened with fettuccine and Kia and baying for cabs. Those were the times that tested men's souls. 6:30 in the morning, forget it. Dirk had. With his resolve well stiffened, Dirk stepped back out of the newsagents into the nippy air of the street and strode off. "Ah, I expect you'll be wanting to pay for that paper then, won't you, Mr. Dirk, sir?" said the newsagent, trotting gently after him. "Ah, Bates," said Dirk loftily, "you and your expectations, always expecting this and expecting that. May I recommend serenity to you? A life that is burdened with expectations is a heavy life. Its fruit is sorrow and disappointment. Learn to be one with the joy of the moment." I think it's 20 pence, that one, sir," said Bates tranquilly. "Tell you what I'll do, Bates, seeing as it's you. Do you have a pen on you at all? A simple ballpoint will suffice." Bates produced one from an inner pocket and handed it to Dirk, who then tore off the corner of the paper on which the price was printed and scribbled IOU above it. He handed the scrap of paper to the newsagent. Shall I put this with the other ones then, sir?" "Put it wherever it will give you the greatest joy, dear Bates. I would want you to put it nowhere less. For now, dear man, farewell." I expect you'll be wanting to give me my pen back as well, Mr. Dirk." "When the times are propitious for such a transaction, my dear Bates," said Dirk, "you may depend upon it. For the moment, higher purposes call it. Joy, Bates, great joy. Bates, please let go of it." After one last listless tug, the little man shrugged and padded back towards his shop. "I expect I'll be seeing you later then, Mr. Dirk," he called out over his shoulder, without enthusiasm. Dirk gave a gracious bow of his head to the man's retreating back, and then hurried on, opening the newspaper at the horoscope page as he did so. "Virtually everything you decide today will be wrong," he said bluntly. Dirk slapped the paper shut with a grunt. He did not for a second hold with the notion that great whirling lumps of rock light years away knew something about your day that you didn't. It just so happened that the great Zaganza was an old friend of his who knew when Dirk's birthday was and always wrote his column deliberately to wind him up. The paper's circulation had dropped by nearly a twelfth since he had taken over doing the horoscope, and only Dirk and the great Zaganza knew why. He hurried on, flapping his way quickly through the rest of the paper. As usual, there was nothing interesting. A lot of stuff about the search for Janice Smith, the missing airline girl from Heathrow, and how she could possibly have disappeared just like that. They printed the latest picture of her, which was on a swing with pigtails aged 6. Her father, Mr. Jim Pierce, was quoted as saying it was quite a good likeness, but she had grown up a lot now and was usually in better focus. Impatiently, Dirk tucked the paper under his arm and strode onwards, his thoughts on a much more interesting topic. £300 a day, plus expenses. He wondered how long he could reasonably expect to sustain in Mr. Anstey his strange delusions that he was about to be murdered by a 7-foot-tall, shaggy-haired creature with huge green eyes and horns who habitually waved things at him. A contract written in some incomprehensible language and signed with a splash of blood, and also a kind of scythe. The other notable feature of this creature was that no one other than his client had been able to see it, which Mr. Anstey dismissed as a trick of the light. 3 days? 4? Dirk didn't think he'd be able to manage a whole week with a straight face, but he was already looking at something like £1,000 for his trouble, and he would stick a new fridge down on the list of tangential but non-negotiable expenses. That would be a good one. Getting the old fridge thrown out was definitely part of the interconnectedness of all things. He began to whistle at the thought of simply getting someone to come round and cart the thing away, turned into Lupton Road, and was surprised at all the police cars there, and the ambulance. He didn't like them being there. It didn't feel right. It didn't sit comfortably in his mind alongside his visions of a new fridge. Dirk knew Lupton Road. It was a wide, tree-lined affair with large, late Victorian terraces which stood tall and sturdily and resented police cars. Resented them if they turned up in numbers, that is, and if their lights were flashing. The inhabitants of Lupton Road liked to see a nice, well-turned-out single police car patrolling up and down the street in a cheerful and robust manner. It kept property values cheerful and robust too. But the moment the lights started flashing in that knuckle-whitening blue, they cast their pallor not only on the neatly pointed bricks that they flashed across, but also on the very values those bricks represented. Anxious faces peered from behind the glass of neighbouring windows and were irradiated by the blue strobes. There were 3 of them, 3 police cars left askew across the road in a way that transcended mere parking. It sent out a massive signal to the world saying that the law was here now and taking charge of things, and that anyone who just had normal, good and cheerful business to conduct in Lupton Road could just fuck off. Dirk hurried up the road, sweat pricking at him beneath his heavy leather coat. A police constable loomed up ahead of him with his arms spread out, playing at being a stop barrier, but Dirk swept him aside in a torrent of words to which the constable was unable to come up with a good response off the top of his head. Dirk sped on to the house. At the door, another policeman stopped him, and Dirk was about to wave an expired Marks & Spencer charge card at him with a deft little flick of the wrist that he had practiced for hours in front of a mirror on those long evenings when nothing much else was on, when the officer suddenly said, "Hey, is your name Gently?" Dirk blinked at him warily. He made a slight grunting noise that could be either yes or no depending on the circumstances. Because the chief has been looking for you." "Has he?" said Dirk. "I recognise you from his description," said the officer, looking him up and down with a slight smirk. "In fact," continued the officer, "he's been using your name in a manner that some might find highly offensive. He even sent Big Bob the Finder off in a car to find you. I can tell you didn't from the fact that you're looking reasonably well. A lot of people get found by Big Bob the Finder. They come in a bit wobbly. Just about able to help us with our inquiries, but that's about all. You better go in. Rather you than me," he added quietly. Dirk glanced at the house. The stripped pine shutters were closed across all the windows. Though in all other respects the house seemed well cared for, groomed into a state of clean, well-appointed affluence, the closed shutters seemed to convey an air of sudden devastation. Oddly, there seemed to be music coming from the basement, or rather, just a single disjointed phrase of thumping music being repeated over and over again. It sounded as if the stylus had got stuck in the groove of a record, and Dirk wondered why no one had turned it off, or at least nudged the stylus along so that the record could continue. The song seemed very vaguely familiar, and Dirk guessed that he had probably heard it on the radio recently, though he couldn't place it. The fragment of lyrics seemed to be something like, "Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up," and so on. "You'll be wanting to go down to the basement," said the officer impassively, as if that was the last thing that anyone in their right mind would be wanting to do. Dirk nodded to him curtly and hurried up the steps to the front door, which was standing slightly ajar. He shook his head and clenched his shoulders, trying to stop his brain fluttering. He went in. The hallway spoke of prosperity imposed on a taste that had originally been formed by student living. The floors were stripped boards, heavily polyurethaned. The walls white, with Greek rugs hung on them, but expensive Greek rugs. Dirk would be prepared to bet, though probably not to pay up, that a thorough search of the house would reveal, amongst who knew what other dark secrets, 500 British Telecom shares and a set of Dylan albums that was complete up to Blood on the Tracks. Another policeman was standing in the hall. He looked terribly young, and he was leaning very slightly back against the wall, staring at the floor and holding his helmet against his stomach. His face was pale and shiny. He looked at Dirk blankly and nodded faintly in the direction of the stairs leading down. Up the stairs came the repeated sound. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it. Dirk was trembling with a rage that was barging around inside him looking for something to hit or throttle. He wished that he could hotly deny that any of this was his fault, but until anybody tried to assert that it was, he couldn't. How long have you been here? He said curtly. The young policeman had to gather himself together to answer. We arrived about half hour ago, he replied in a thick voice. Hell of a morning, rushing around. Don't tell me about rushing around, said Dirk, completely meaninglessly. He launched himself down the stairs. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it. At the bottom, there was a narrow corridor. The main door off it was heavily cracked and hanging off its hinges. It opened into a large double room. Dirk was about to enter when a figure emerged from it and stood barring his way. I hate the fact that this case has got you mixed up in it, said the figure. I hate it very much. Tell me what you've got to do with it so I know exactly what it is I'm hating. Dirk stared at the neat, thin face in astonishment. Gilks, he said. Don't stand there looking like a startled what's-his-name. What are those things that aren't seals? Much worse than seals. Big blubbery things. Dugongs. Don't stand there looking like a startled dugong. Why has that, Gilks pointed into the room behind him, why has that man in there got your name and telephone number on an envelope full of money? How started Dirk. How, may I ask, do you come to be here, Gilks? What are you doing so far from the fens? Surprised you find it dank enough for you here. £300, said Gilks. Why? Perhaps you'd allow me to speak to my client, said Dirk. Your client, eh? Said Gilks grimly. Yes, all right. Why don't you speak to him? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. He stood back stiffly and waved Dirk into the room. Dirk gathered his thoughts and entered the room in a state of controlled composure, which lasted for just over a second. Most of his client was sitting quietly in a comfortable chair in front of the hi-fi. The chair was placed in the optimal listening position, about twice as far back from the speakers as the distance between them, which is usually considered to be ideal for stereo imaging. He seemed generally to be casual and relaxed, with his legs crossed and a half-finished cup of coffee on the small table beside him. Distressingly, though, his head was sitting neatly on the middle of the record, which was revolving on the hi-fi turntable, with the tone arm snuggling up against the neck and constantly being deflected back into the same groove. As the head revolved, it seemed once every 1.8 seconds or so to shoot Dirk a reproachful glance, as if to say, see what happens when you don't turn up on time like I asked you to. Then it would sweep on round to the wall, round, round, and back to the front again with more reproach. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it. The room swayed a little around Dirk, and he put his hand out against the wall to steady it. Was there any particular service you were engaged to provide for your client? Said Gilks behind him, very quietly. Just a small matter, said Dirk weakly. Nothing connected with all this. No, he didn't mention any of this kind of thing at all. Well, look, I can see you're busy. I think I'd better just collect my fee and leave. You say he left it out for me? Having said this, Dirk sat heavily on a small bentwood chair standing behind him and broke it. Gilks hauled him back to his feet again and propped him up against the wall. Briefly, he left the room, then came back with a small jug of water and a glass on a tray. He poured some water into the glass, took it to Dirk, and threw it at him. Better? No, spluttered Dirk. Can't you at least turn the record off? That's forensics job. Can't touch anything till the clever dicks have been. Maybe that's them now. Look, go out onto the patio and get some air. Chain yourself to the railing and beat yourself up a little. I'm pushed for time myself. And try to look less green, will you? It's not your colour. But don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it. Gilks turned round, looking tired and cross, and was about to go out and up the stairs to meet the newcomers, whose voices could be heard up on the ground floor, when he paused and watched the head revolving patiently on its heavy platter for a few seconds. You know, he said at last, these smart aleck show-off suicides really make me tired. They only do it to annoy. Suicide, said Dirk. Gilks glanced round at him. Window secured with iron bars half an inch thick, he said. Door locked from the inside with the key still in the lock. Furniture piled against the inside of the door. French windows to the patio locked with mortise door bolts. No signs of a tunnel. If it was murder, then the murderer must have stopped to do a damn fine job of glazing on the way out, except that all the putty's old and painted over. No, nobody's left this room and nobody's broken into it. Except for us, and I'm pretty sure we didn't do it. No, I haven't time to fiddle around on this one. Obviously suicide and just done to be difficult. I've half a mind to do the deceased for wasting police time. Tell you what, he said, glancing at his watch. You've got 10 minutes. If you come up with a plausible explanation of how he did it that I can put in my report, I'll let you keep the evidence in the envelope, minus 20% for the emotional wear and tear involved in not punching you in the mouth. Dirk wondered for a moment whether or not to mention the visits his client claimed to have received from a strange and violent, green-eyed, fur-clad giant who regularly emerged out of nowhere, bellowing about contracts and obligations and waving a 3-foot glittering-edged scythe, but decided, on balance, no. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it. He was seething with himself at last. He had not been able to seethe at himself properly over the death of his client because it was too huge and horrific a burden to bear. But now he had been humiliated by Gilks and found himself in too wobbly and disturbed a state to fight back, so he was able to seethe at himself about that. He turned sharply away from his tormentor and let himself out into the patio garden to be alone with his seethings. The patio was a small, paved, west-facing area at the rear, which was largely deprived of light, cut off as it was by the high back wall of the house and by the high wall of some industrial building that backed onto the rear. In the middle of it stood, for who knew what possible reason, a stone sundial. If any light at all fell on the sundial, you'd know that it was pretty close to noon GMT. Other than that, birds perched on it. A few plants sulked in pots. Dirk jabbed a cigarette in his mouth and burnt a lot of the end of it fiercely. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, still nagged from inside the house. Neat garden walls separated the patio on either side from the gardens of neighbouring houses. The one to the left was the same size as this one. The one to the right extended a little further, benefiting from the fact that the industrial building finished flush with the intervening garden wall. There was an air of well-kemptness. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just a sense that all was well and that upkeep on the houses was no problem. The house to the right, in particular, looked as if it had had its brickwork repointed quite recently and its windows reglossed. Dirk took a large gulp of air and stood for a second staring up into what could be seen of the sky, which was grey and hazy. A single dark speck was wheeling against the underside of the clouds. Dirk watched this for a while, glad of any focus for his thoughts other than the horrors of the room he had just left. He was vaguely aware of comings and goings within the room, of a certain amount of tape measuring happening, of a feeling that photographs were being taken, and that severed head removal activities were taking place. Don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it up, pick it up, pick it, don't pick it. Somebody at last picked it up. The nagging repetition was at last hushed, and now the gentle sound of a distant television floated peacefully on the noontime air. Dirk, however, was having a great deal of difficulty in taking it all in. He was much more aware of taking a succession of huge swimmy whacks to the head, which were the assaults of guilt. It was not the normal background noise type of guilt that comes from just being alive this far into the 20th century, and which Dirk was usually fairly adept at dealing with. It was an actual stunning sense of, this specific terrible thing is specifically and terribly my fault. All the normal mental moves wouldn't let him get out of the path of the huge pendulum. Wham it came again, whiz, wham, again and again, wham, wham, wham. He tried to remember any of the details of what his late client had said to him, but it was virtually impossible. Wham, with all this whamming taking place. The man had said that he was being pursued by a large, hairy, green-eyed monster armed with a scythe. Wham. Dirk had secretly smiled to himself about this. Wham. And he thought, what a silly man. Wham. A scythe and a contract. Wham. He hadn't known or even had the faintest idea as to what the contract was for. Of course, Dirk had thought. Wham. But he had had a vague feeling that it might have had something to do with a potato. There was a bit of a complicated story attached to that. Wham. Dirk had nodded seriously at this point. Wham. And made a reassuring tick on a pad which he kept on his desk for the express purpose of making reassuring ticks on. He had prided himself at that moment on having managed to convey the impression that he had made a tick in a small box marked potatoes. Wham. Mr. Anstey had said he would explain further about the potatoes when Dirk arrived to carry out his task. And Dirk had promised, easily, casually, wham, with an airy wave of his hand, to be there at 6:30 in the morning, because the contract fell due at 7 o'clock. Wham. Dirk remembered having made another tick in a notional potato contract falls due at 7 a.m. box. Wham. He couldn't handle all this whamming anymore. He couldn't blame himself for what had happened. Well, he could. Of course he could. He did. It was in fact his fault. The point was that he couldn't continue to blame himself for what had happened and think clearly about it, which he was going to have to do. He would have to dig this horrible thing up by the roots, and if he was going to be fit to do it, he had somehow to divest himself, wham, of this whamming. A huge wave of anger surged over him as he contemplated his predicament and the tangled distress of his life. He hated this neat patio. He hated all this sundial stuff, and all these neatly painted windows, all these hideously trim roofs. He wanted to blame it all on paintwork rather than on himself, on the revoltingly tidy patio paving stones, on the sheer disgusting abomination of the neatly repointed brickwork. Excuse me? What? He whirled round, caught unawares by this intrusion into his private raging of a quiet, polite voice. Are you connected with The woman indicated all the unpleasantness and the lower ground floorness and the horrible sort of policeness of things next door to her, with a little floating movement of her wrist. Her wrist wore a red bracelet which matched the frames of her glasses. She was looking over the garden wall from the house on the right, with an air of slightly anxious distaste. Dirk glared at her speechlessly. She looked about 40-something-ish and neat, with an instant and unmistakable quality of advertising about her. She gave a troubled sigh. "I know it's probably all very terrible and everything," she said, "but do you think it'll take long? We only called in the police because the noise of that ghastly record was driving us up the wall. It's all a bit..." She gave him a look of silent appeal, and Dirk decided that it could all be her fault. She could, as far as he was concerned, take the blame for everything while he sorted it out. She deserved it, if only for wearing a bracelet like that. Without a word, he turned his back on her and took his fury back inside the house, where it began rapidly to freeze into something hard and efficient. "Gilks," he said, "your smart Alex suicide theory, I like it. It works for me. But I think I see how the clever bastard pulled it off. Bring me pen, bring me paper." He sat down with a flourish at the Cherrywood farmhouse table, which occupied the centre of the rear portion of the room, and deftly sketched out a scheme of events which involved a number of household or kitchen implements, swinging, weighted light fitting, some very precise timing, and hinged on the vital fact that the record turntable was Japanese. "That should keep the forensic chaps happy," said Dirk briskly to Gilks. The forensic chaps glanced at it, took in its salient points, and liked them. They were simple, implausible, and of exactly that nature which a coroner who liked the same sort of holidays in Marbella which they did would be sure to relish. "Unless," said Dirk casually, "you're interested in the notion that the deceased had entered into some kind of diabolical contract with a supernatural agency for which payment was now being exacted." The forensic chaps glanced at each other and shook their heads. There was a strong sense from them that the morning was wearing on, and that this kind of talk was only introducing unnecessary complications into a case which otherwise would be well behind them before lunch. Dirk made a satisfied shrug, peeled off his share of the evidence, and with a final nod to the constabulary, made his way back upstairs. As he reached the hallway, it suddenly became apparent to him that the gentle sounds of daytime television, which he had heard from out in the garden, had previously been masked from inside by the insistent sound of the record stuck in its groove. He was surprised now to realize that they were in fact coming from somewhere upstairs in this house. With a quick look around to see that he was not observed, he stood on the bottom step of the staircase leading to the upstairs floors of the house, and glanced up them in surprise. The stairs were carpeted with a tastefully austere matting type of substance. Dirk quietly made his way up them, past some tastefully dried large things in a pot that stood on the first landing, and looked into the rooms on the first floor. They too were tasteful and dried. The larger of the two bedrooms was the only one that showed any signs of current use. It had clearly been designed to allow the morning light to play on delicately arranged flowers and duvets stuffed with something like hay, but there was a feeling that socks and used shaving heads were instead beginning to gather the room into their grip. There was a distinct absence of anything female in the room, the same sort of absence that a missing picture leaves behind it on a wall. There was an air of tension and of sadness and of things needing to be cleaned out from under the bed. The bathroom, which opened out from it, had a gold disc hung on the wall in front of the lavatory, the sales of 500,000 copies of a record called Hot Potato, by a band called Pugilism and the Third Autistic Cuckoo. Dirk had a vague recollection of having read part of an interview with the leader of the band, there were only two of them and one of them was the leader, in a Sunday paper. He had been asked about their name, and he had said there was an interesting story about it, though it turned out not to be. "It can mean whatever people want it to mean," he had added with a shrug from the sofa of his manager's office, somewhere off Oxford Street. Dirk remembered visualizing the journalist nodding politely and writing this down. A vile knot had formed in Dirk's stomach, which he had eventually softened with gin. Hot potato, thought Dirk. It suddenly occurred to him, looking at the gold disc hanging in its red frame, that the record on which the late Mr. Anstis' head had been perched was obviously this one. Hot potato. Don't pick it up. What could that mean? Whatever people wanted it to mean, Dirk thought with bad grace. The other thing that he remembered now about the interview was that Payne, the leader of Pugilism and the Third Autistic Cuckoo was called Payne, claimed to have written the lyrics down more or less verbatim from a conversation which he or somebody had overheard in a cafe or a sauna or an aeroplane or something like that. Dirk wondered how the originators of the conversation would feel to hear their words being repeated in the circumstances in which he had just heard them. He peered more closely at the label in the centre of the gold record. At the top of the label it simply said, "ARG!" while underneath the actual title were the writer's credits, Paynton, Mulville, Anstey. Mulville was presumably the member of Pugilism and the Third Autistic Cuckoo who wasn't the leader, and Jeff Anstey's inclusion on the writing credits of a major selling single was probably what had paid for his house. When Anstey had talked about the contract having something to do with potato, he'd assumed that Dirk knew what he meant, and he, Dirk, had as easily assumed that Anstey was blithering. It was very easy to assume that someone who was talking about green-eyed monsters with scythes was also blithering when he talked about potatoes. Dirk sighed to himself with deep uneasiness. He took a dislike to the neat way the trophy was hanging on the wall, and adjusted it a little so that it hung at a more humane and untidy angle. Doing this caused an envelope to fall out from behind the frame and flutter towards the floor. Dirk tried unsuccessfully to catch it. With an unfit grunt, he bent over and picked the thing up. It was a largish cream envelope of rich, heavy paper, roughly slit open at one end and resealed with Scotch tape. In fact, it looked as if it had been opened and resealed with fresh layers of tape many times, an impression which was borne out by the number of names to which the envelope had in its time been addressed, each successively crossed out and replaced by another. The last name on it was that of Jeff Anstey. At least Dirk assumed that it was the last name, because it was the only one that had not been crossed out, and crossed out heavily. Dirk peered at some of the other names, trying to make them out. Some memory was stirred by a couple of the names which he could just about discern, but he needed to examine the envelope much more closely. He had been meaning to buy himself a magnifying glass ever since he had become a detective, but had never got around to it. He also did not possess a penknife, so reluctantly he decided that the most prudent course was to tuck the envelope away for the moment in one of the deeper recesses of his coat and examine it later in privacy. He glanced quickly behind the frame of the gold disc to see if any other goodies might emerge, but was disappointed, and so he quit the bathroom and resumed his exploration of the house. The other bedroom was neat and soulless, unused. A pine bed, a duvet, and an old battered chest of drawers that had been revived by being plunged into a vat of acid were its main features. Dirk pulled the door of it closed behind him and started to ascend the small, wobbly, white-painted stairway that led up to an attic room from which the sounds of Bugs Bunny could be heard. At the top of the stairs was a minute landing, which opened on one side into a bathroom so small that it would best be used by someone standing outside and sticking into it whichever limb you wanted to wash. The door to it was kept ajar by a length of green hosepipe, which trailed from the cold tap of the wash basin, out of the bathroom, across the landing, and into the only other room here at the top of the house. It was an attic room with a severely pitched roof, which offered only a few spots where a person of anything approaching average height could stand up. Dirk stood hunched in the doorway and surveyed its contents, nervous of what he might find amongst them. There was a general grunginess about the place. The curtains were closed, and little light made it past them into the room, which was otherwise illuminated only by the flickering glow of an animated rabbit. An unmade bed with dank, screwed-up sheets was pushed under a particularly low angle of the ceiling. Parts of the walls and the more nearly vertical surfaces of the ceiling were covered with pictures crudely cut out of magazines. The hosepipe curled across the floor and led around the side of an elderly armchair pulled up in front of the television set. The rabbit rampaged. The glow of his rampagings played on the frayed edges of the armchair. Bugs was wrestling with the controls of an aeroplane which was plunging to the ground. Suddenly he saw a button marked autopilot and pressed it. A cupboard opened and a robot pilot clambered out, took one look at the situation and bailed out. The plane hurtled on towards the ground, but luckily ran out of fuel just before reaching it, and so the rabbit was saved. Dirk could also see the top of a head. The hair on this head was dark, matted and greasy. Dirk watched it for a long, uneasy moment before advancing slowly into the room to see what, if anything, it was attached to. His relief at discovering, as he rounded the armchair, that the head was, after all, attached to a living body, was a little marred by the sight of the living body to which it was attached. Slumped in the armchair was a boy. He was probably about 13 or 14, and although he didn't look ill in any specific physical way, he was definitely not a well person. His hair sagged on his head sagged on his shoulders, and he lay in the armchair in a sort of limp, crumpled way, as if he'd been hurled there from a passing train. He was dressed merely in a cheap leather jacket and sleeping bag. Dirk stared at him. Who was he? What was a boy doing here watching television in a house where someone had just been decapitated? Did he know what had happened? Did Gilks know about him? Had Gilks even bothered to come up here? It was, after all, several flights of stairs for a busy policeman with a tricky suicide on his hands. After Dirk had been standing there for 20 seconds or so, the boy's eyes climbed up towards him, failed utterly to acknowledge him in any way at all, and then dropped again and locked back onto the rabbit. Dirk was unused to making quite such a minuscule impact on anybody. He checked to be sure that he did have his huge leather coat and his absurd red hat on, and that he was properly and dramatically silhouetted by the light of the doorway. He felt momentarily deflated, and said, by way of self-introduction, but it didn't get the boy's attention. He didn't like this. The kid was deliberately and maliciously watching television at him. He frowned. There was a kind of steamy tension building in the room, it seemed to Dirk, a kind of difficult hissing quality to the whole air of the place, which he did not know how to respond to. It rose in intensity, and then suddenly ended with an abrupt click, which made Dirk start. The boy unwound himself like a slow, fat snake, leaned sideways over the far side of the armchair, and made some elaborate unseen preparations, which clearly involved, as Dirk now realized, an electric kettle. When he resumed his earlier splayed posture, it was with the addition of a plastic pot clutched in his right hand, from which he forked rubbery strands of steaming gunk into his mouth. The rabbit brought his affairs to a conclusion and gave way to a jeering comedian who wished the viewers to buy a certain brand of lager on the basis of nothing better than his own hardly disinterested say-so. Dirk felt that it was time to make a slightly greater impression on the proceedings than he had so far managed to do. He stepped forward directly into the boy's line of sight. "Kid?" Dirk said in a tone that he hoped would sound firm but gentle, and not in any way at all patronizing or affected or gauche. "I need to know who—" He was distracted at that moment by the sight which met him from the new position in which he was standing. On the other side of the armchair, there was a large, half-full catering-sized box of pot noodles, a large, half-full catering-sized box of Mars bars, a half-demolished pyramid of cans of soft drink, and the end of the hosepipe. The hosepipe ended in a plastic tap nozzle and was obviously used for refilling the kettle. Dirk had simply been going to ask the boy who he was, but seen from this angle, the family resemblance was unmistakable. He was clearly the son of the lately decapitated Jeffrey Anstey. Perhaps this behavior was just his way of dealing with shock, or perhaps he really didn't know what had happened. Or perhaps he... Dirk hardly liked to think. In fact, he was finding it hard to think clearly, while the television beside him was, on behalf of a toothpaste manufacturing company, trying to worry him deeply about some of the things which might be going on in his mouth. "Okay," he said, "I don't like to disturb you at what I know must be a difficult and distressing time for you, but I need to know first of all if you actually realize that this is a difficult and distressing time for you." Nothing. All right, thought Dirk, time for a little judicious toughness. He leant back against the wall, stuck his hands in his pockets in an "okay if that's the way you want to play it" manner, stared moodily at the floor for a few seconds, then swung his head up and let the boy have a hard look right between the eyes. "I have to tell you, kid," he said tersely, "your father's dead." This might have worked if it hadn't been for a very popular and long-running commercial which started at that moment. It seemed to Dirk to be a particularly astounding example of the genre. The opening sequence showed the angel Lucifer being hurled from heaven into the pit of hell, where he then lay on a burning lake until a passing demon arrived and gave him a can of a fizzy soft drink called Shades, spelt with a small S and a capital H. Lucifer took it and tried it. He greedily guzzled the whole contents of the can, and then turned to camera, slipped on some Porsche-designed sunglasses, said, "Now we're really cooking," and lay back basking in the glow of the burning coals being heaped around him. At that point, an impossibly deep and growly American voice, which sounded as if it had itself crawled from the pit of hell, or at least from a Soho basement drinking club, to which it was keen to return as soon as possible to marinate itself into shape for the next voiceover, said, "Shades, the drink from hell." And the can revolved a little to obscure the initial S and thus spell Hades. The theology of this seemed a little confused, reflected Dirk, but what was one tiny extra droplet of misinformation in such a raging torrent? Lucifer then mugged at the camera again and said, "I could really fall for this stuff." And just in case the viewer had been rendered completely insensate by all these goings-on, the opening shot of Lucifer being hurled from heaven was briefly replayed in order to emphasize the word fall. The boy's attention was entirely captivated by this. Dirk squatted down in between the boy and the screen. "Listen to me," he began. The boy craned his neck round to look past Dirk at the screen. He had to redistribute his limbs in the chair in order to be able to do this and continue to fork a pot noodle into himself. "Listen," insisted Dirk again. Dirk felt he was beginning to be in serious danger of losing the upper hand in this situation. It wasn't merely that the boy's attention was on the television, it was that nothing else seemed to have any meaning or independent existence for him at all. Dirk was merely a featureless object in the way of the television. The boy seemed to bear him no malice, he merely wished to see past him. "Look, can we turn this off for a moment?" Dirk said, and he tried not to make it sound testy. The boy did not respond. Maybe there was a slight stiffening of the shoulders, maybe it was a shrug. Dirk turned around and was at a loss to find which button to push to turn the television off. The whole control panel seemed to be dedicated to the single purpose of keeping itself turned on. There was no single button marked on or off. Eventually Dirk simply disconnected the set from the power socket on the wall and turned back to the boy, who broke his nose. Dirk felt his septum crunching from the terrific impact of the boy's forehead as they both toppled heavily backwards against the set. but the noise of the bone breaking and the noise of his own cry of pain as it broke was completely obliterated by the howling screams of rage that erupted from the boy's throat. Dirk flailed helplessly to try and protect himself from the fury of the onslaught, but the boy was on top with his elbow in Dirk's eye, his knees pounding first on Dirk's ribcage, then his jaw, and then on Dirk's already traumatized nose, as he scrambled over him to try and reconnect the power to the television. He then settled back comfortably into the armchair and watched with a moody and unsettled eye as the picture reassembled itself. "You could at least have waited for the news," he said in a dull voice. Dirk gaped at him. He sat huddled on the floor, coddling his bleeding nose in his hands, and gaped at the monstrously disinterested creature. He protested, and then gave up for the time being while he probed his nose for the damage. There was definitely a wobbly bit that clicked nastily between his fingers, and the whole thing seemed suddenly to be a horribly unfamiliar shape. He fished a handkerchief out of his pocket and held it up to his face. Blood spread easily through it. He staggered to his feet, brushed aside non-existent offers of help, stomped out of the room and into the tiny bathroom. There he yanked the hosepipe angrily off the tap, found a towel, soaked it in cold water, and held it to his face for a minute or two until the flow of blood gradually slowed to a trickle and stopped. He stared at himself in the mirror. His nose was quite definitely leaning at a slightly rakish angle. He tried bravely to shift it, but not bravely enough. It hurt abominably, so he contented himself with dabbing at it a little more with the wet towel and swearing quietly. Then he stood there for a second or two longer, leaning against the basin, breathing heavily, and practicing saying, "All right," fiercely into the mirror. It came out as "all right," and lacked any real authority. When he felt sufficiently braced, or at least as braced as he was likely to feel in the immediate future, he turned and stalked grimly back into the den of the beast. The beast was sitting quietly absorbing news of some of the exciting and stimulating game shows that the evening held in store for the determined viewer, and did not look up as Dirk re-entered. Dirk walked briskly over to the window and drew the curtains sharply back, half hoping that the beast might shrivel up shrieking if exposed to daylight, but other than wrinkling up its nose, it did not react. A dark shadow flapped briefly across the window, but the angle was such that Dirk could not see what caused it. He turned and faced the boy beast. The midday news bulletin was starting on television, and the boy seemed somehow a little more open, a little more receptive to the world outside the flickering, coloured rectangle. He glanced up at Dirk with a sour, tired look. "What do you want, anyway?" he said. "I'll tell you what I want," said Dirk fiercely but hopelessly. "I want... I got a moment. I know that, Faith." Dirk's attention had switched suddenly to the television screen, where a rather more up-to-date photograph of the missing airline check-in girl was being shown. "What are you doing here?" said the boy. "Shh," said Dirk, and perched himself down on the arm of the chair, peering intently at the face on the screen. It had been taken about a year ago, before the girl had learnt about corporate lip gloss. She had frizzy hair and a frumpy put-upon look. "Who are you? What's going on?" insisted the boy. "Look, shut up!" snapped Dirk. "I'm trying to watch this." The newscaster said that the police professed themselves to be mystified by the fact that there was no trace of Janice Smith at the scene of the incident. They explained that there was a limit to the number of times they could search the same buildings, and appealed for anyone who might have a clue as to her whereabouts to come forward. "That's my secretary! That's Miss Pierce!" exclaimed Dirk in astonishment. The boy was not interested in Dirk's ex-secretary, who gave up trying to attract Dirk's attention. He wriggled out of the sleeping bag and sloped off to the bathroom. Dirk sat staring at the television, bewildered that he hadn't realized before who the missing girl was. Still, there was no reason why he should have done, he realized. Marriage had changed her name, and this was the first time they had shown a photograph that actually identified her. So far, he had taken no real interest in the strange incident at the airport, but now it demanded his attention. The explosion was now officially designated an act of God. But, thought Dirk, what God? And why? What God would be hanging around Terminal 2 of Heathrow Airport trying to catch the 1537 flight to Oslo? After the miserable lassitude of the last few weeks, he suddenly had a great deal that required his immediate attention. He frowned in deep thought for a few moments, and hardly noticed when the beast boy snuck back in and snuggled back into his sleeping bag just in time for the advertisements to start. The first one showed how a perfectly ordinary stock tube could form the natural focus of a normal, happy family life. Dirk leapt to his feet, but even as he was about to start questioning the boy again, his heart sank as he looked at him. The beast was far away, sunk back in his dark, flickering lair, and Dirk did not feel inclined to disturb him again at the moment. He contented himself with barking at the unresponding child that he would be back, and bustled heavily down the stairs, his big leather coat flapping madly behind him. In the hallway, he encountered the loathed Gilks once more. "What happened to you?" said the policeman sharply, catching sight of Dirk's bruised and bulging nose. "Only what you told me," said Dirk innocently. "I beat myself up." Gilks demanded to know what he'd been doing, and Dirk generously explained that there was a witness upstairs with some interesting information to impart. He suggested that Gilks go and have a word with him, but that it would be best if he turned off the television first. Gilks nodded carefully. He started to go up the stairs, but Dirk stopped him. "Does anything strike you as strange about this house?" he said. "What did you say?" said Gilks in irritation. "Something strange," said Dirk. "Something what?" "Strange," insisted Dirk. "Strange?" "That's right, strange." Gilks shrugged. "Like what?" he said. "It seems to be completely soulless." "Completely what?" "Soulless." He tried again. "Soulless. I think that's very interesting." With that, he doffed his hat politely and swept on out of the house and up the street, where an eagle swooped out of the sky at him and came within a whisker of causing him to fall under a 73 bus on its way south. For the next 20 minutes, hideous yells and screams emanated from the top floor of the house in Lupton Road and caused much tension among the neighbours. The ambulance took away the upper and lower remains of Mr. Anstey, and also a policeman with a bleeding face. For a short while after this, there was quietness. Then, another police car drew up outside the house. A lot of "Bob's ear" type of remarks floated from the house as an extremely large and burly policeman heaved himself out of the car and bustled up the steps. A few minutes and a great deal of screaming and yelling later, he re-emerged also clutching his face and drove off in deep dudgeon, squealing his tires in a violent and unnecessary manner. 20 minutes later, a van arrived from which emerged another policeman carrying a tiny pocket television set. He entered the house and re-emerged a short while later leading a docile 13-year-old boy who was content with his new toy. Once all policemen had departed, save for the single squad car which remained parked outside to keep watch on the house, a large, hairy, green-eyed figure emerged from its hiding place behind one of the molecules in the large basement room. It propped its side against one of the hi-fi speakers, dipped a long, gnarled finger in the almost congealed pool of blood that had collected on the deck of the turntable, smeared the finger across the bottom of a sheet of thick, yellowing paper, and then disappeared off into a dark and hidden other world, whistling a strange and vicious tune, and returning only briefly to collect its side. A little earlier in the morning, at a comfortable distance from all these events, set at a comfortable distance from a well-proportioned window, through which cool mid-morning light was streaming, lay an elderly, one-eyed man in a white bed. A newspaper sat like a half-collapsed tent on the floor, where it had been hurled 2 minutes before, at shortly after 10 o'clock, by the clock on the bedside table. The room was not large, but was furnished in excessively bland good taste, as if it were a room in an expensive private hospital or clinic, which is exactly what it was, the Woods Head Hospital, set in its own small but well-kept grounds on the outskirts of a small but well-kept village in the Cotswolds. The man was awake, but not glad to be. His skin was very delicately old, like finely stretched, translucent parchment, delicately freckled. His exquisitely frail hands lay slightly curled on the pure white linen sheets, and quivered very faintly. His name was variously given as Mr. Odwin, or Wodin, or Odin. He is, a god. And furthermore, he was that least good of all gods to be alongside, a cross god. His one eye glinted. He was cross because of what he'd been reading in the newspapers, which was that another god had been cutting loose and making a nuisance of himself. It didn't say that in the newspapers, of course. It didn't say, "God cuts loose, makes nuisance of himself in airport." It merely described the resulting devastation, and was at a loss to draw any meaningful conclusions from it. The story had been deeply unsatisfactory in all sorts of ways, on account of its perplexing inconclusiveness, its going-nowhereness, and the irritating, from the newspaper's point of view, lack of any good, solid carnage. There was, of course, a mystery attached to the lack of carnage, but a newspaper preferred a good whack of carnage to a mere mystery any day of the week. Odin, however, had no such difficulty in knowing what was going on. The accounts had Thor written all over them in letters much too big for anyone other than another god to see. He had thrown this morning's paper aside in irritation, and was now trying to concentrate on his relaxation exercises in order to avoid getting too disturbed about all of this. These involved breathing in a certain way and breathing out in a certain other way, and were good for his blood pressure, and so on. It was not as if he was about to die or anything. Ha! but there was no doubt that at his time of life, he preferred to take things easy and look after himself. Best of all, he liked to sleep. Sleeping was a very important activity for him. He liked to sleep for longish periods, great swathes of time. Merely sleeping overnight was not taking the business seriously. He enjoyed a good night's sleep and wouldn't miss one for the world, but he didn't regard it as anything even half approaching enough. He liked to be asleep by 11:30 in the morning, if possible, and if that could come directly after a nice leisurely lie-in, then so much the better. A little light breakfast and a quick trip to the bathroom while fresh linen was applied to his bed is really all the activity he liked to undertake, and he took care that it didn't jangle the sleepiness out of him and thus disturb his afternoon of napping. Sometimes he was able to spend an entire week asleep, and this he regarded as a good snooze. He had also slept through the whole of 1986 and hadn't missed it. But he knew to his deep disgruntlement that he would shortly have to arise and undertake a sacred and irritating trust. Sacred because it was godlike, or at least involved gods, and irritating because of the particular god that it involved. Sneakily, he twitched the curtains at a distance, using nothing but his divine will. He sighed heavily. He needed to think, and, what was more, it was time for his morning visit to the bathroom. He rang for the orderly. The orderly arrived promptly in his well-pressed, loose-green tunic, good-morninged cheerfully, and bustled around locating bedroom slippers and dressing gown. He helped Odin out of bed, which was a little like rolling a stuffed crow out of a box, and escorted him slowly to the bathroom. Odin walked stiffly, like a head hung between two heavy stilts, draped in striped viola and white toweling. The orderly knew Odin as Mr. Odwin, and didn't realize that he was a god, which was something that Odin tended to keep quiet about, and wished that Thor would too. Thor was the god of thunder, and, frankly, acted like it. It was inappropriate. He seemed unwilling, or unable, or maybe just too stupid. As soon as Odin had completed his stately hobble to the bathroom floor, two nurses hurried in and stripped and remade the bed with immense precision, patting down the fresh linen, pulling it taut, turning it and tucking it. One of the nurses, clearly the senior, was plump and matronly. The other, younger, darker and more generally bird-like. The newspaper was whisked off the floor and neatly refolded. The floor was briskly hoovered, the curtains hooked back, the flowers and the untouched fruit replaced with fresh flowers and fresh fruit that would, like every piece of fruit before them, remain untouched. When, after a little while, the old god's morning ablutions had been completed and the bathroom door reopened, the room had been transformed. The actual differences were tiny, of course, but the effect was of a subtle but magical transformation into something cool and fresh. Odin nodded in quiet satisfaction to see it. He made a little show of inspecting the bed, like a monarch inspecting a line of soldiers. "Is it well tucked?" he asked in his old and whispery voice. "It is very well tucked, Mr. Odwin," said the senior nurse with an obsequious beam. "Is it neatly turned?" It clearly was. This was merely a ritual. "Turned very neatly indeed, Mr. Odwin," said the nurse. "I supervised the turning down of the sheets myself." "I'm very glad of that, Sister Bailey. Very glad," said Odin. "You have a fine eye for a trimly turned fold. It alarms me to know what I shall do without you." "Well, I'm not about to go anywhere, Mr. Odwin," said Sister Bailey, oozing happy reassurance. "But you won't last forever, Sister Bailey," said Odin. It was a remark that puzzled Sister Bailey on the times she'd heard it, because of its apparent extreme callousness. "Sure, and none of us last forever, Mr. Odwin," she said gently, as she and the other nurse between them managed the difficult task of lifting Odin back into bed while keeping his dignity intact. "You're Irish, aren't you, Sister Bailey?" he asked, once he was properly settled. "I am indeed so, Mr. Odwin. Knew an Irishman once, thin something. Told me a lot of stuff I didn't need to know. Never told me about the linen. Still, I know now." He nodded curtly at this memory, and lowered his head stiffly back onto the firmly plumped-up pillows, and ran the back of his finely freckled hand over the folded-back linen sheet. Quite simply, he was in love with linen. Clean, lightly starched, white Irish linen, pressed, folded, tucked. The words themselves were almost a litany of desire for him. In centuries, nothing had obsessed him or moved him so much as the linen did now. He could not for the life of him understand how it could ever have cared for anything else. Linen and sleep. Sleep and linen. Sleep in linen. Sleep. Sister Bailey regarded him with a sort of proprietary fondness. She did not know that he was a god as such. In fact, she thought he was probably an old film producer or Nazi war criminal. Certainly, he had an accent which she couldn't quite place, and his careless civility, his natural selfishness, and his obsession with personal hygiene spoke of a past that was rich with horrors. If she could have been transported to where she might see her secretive patient enthroned, warrior father of the warrior gods of Asgard, she would not have been surprised. That is not quite true, in fact. She would have been startled quite out of her wits, but she would at least have recognized that it was consistent with the qualities she perceived in him, once she had recovered from the shock of discovering that virtually everything the human race had ever chosen to believe in was true, or that it continued to be true long after the human race particularly needed it to be true anymore. Odin dismissed his medical attendants with a gesture, having first asked for his personal assistant to be found and sent to him once more. This caused Sister Bailey to tighten her lips just a very little. She did not like Mr. Odin's personal assistant, general factotum, manservant, call him what you will. His eyes were malevolent, he made her jump, and she strongly suspected him of making unspeakable suggestions to his nurses during their tea breaks. He had what Sister Bailey supposed was what people meant by an olive complexion, in that it was extraordinarily close to being green. Sister Bailey was convinced that it was not right at all. She was, of course, the last person to judge somebody by the colour of their skin. Or if not absolutely the last, she had at least done it as recently as yesterday afternoon, when an African diplomat had been brought in to have some gallstones removed, and she had conceived an instant resentment of him. She didn't like him. She couldn't say exactly what it was she didn't like about him, because she was a nurse, not a taxi driver, and she wouldn't let her personal feelings show for an instant. She was much too professional, much too good at her job, and treated everyone with a more or less equal, efficient and cheerful courtesy. Even, she thought, and a profound iciness settled on her at this point, even Mr. Ragg. Mr. Ragg was the name of Mr. Odwin's personal assistant. There was nothing she could do about it. It was not her place to criticize Mr. Odwin's personal arrangements. But if it had been her business, which it wasn't, then she would greatly have preferred it, and not just for herself, but for Mr. Odwin's own well-being as well, which was the important thing, if he could have employed someone who didn't give her the absolute heebie-jeebies. That was all. She thought no more about it, merely went to look for him. She had been relieved to discover when she came on duty this morning that Mr. Ragg had left the premises the previous night, but had then, with a keen sense of disappointment, spotted him returning about an hour or so ago. She found him exactly where he was not supposed to be. He was squatting on one of the seats in the visitors' waiting room, wearing what looked horribly like a soiled and discarded doctor's gown that was much too big for him. Not only that, but he was playing a thinly unmusical tune on a sort of pipe that he had obviously carved out of a large disposable hypodermic syringe, which he absolutely should not have had. He glanced up at her with his quick dancing eyes, grinned and continued to tootle and squeak, only significantly louder. Sister Bailey ran through in her mind all the things that it was completely pointless to say about either the coat or the syringe, or about him being in the visitors' room frightening or preparing to frighten the visitors. She knew she wouldn't be able to stand the air of injured innocence with which he would reply, or the preposterous absurdity of his answers. Her only course was simply to let it pass and just get him away from the room and out of the way as quickly as possible. "Mr. Odwin would like to see you," she said. She tried to jam some of her normal lilting quality into her voice, but it just wouldn't go. She wished his eyes would stop dancing like that. Apart from finding it highly disturbing from both a medical and aesthetic point of view, she also could not help but be piqued by the impression it conveyed that there were at least 37 things in the room more interesting than her. He gazed at her in this disconcerting manner for a few seconds, then, muttering that there was no peace for the wicked, not even the extremely wicked, he pushed past Sister Bailey and skedaddled up the corridor to receive instructions from his lord and master, quickly, before his lord and master fell asleep. By the end of the morning, Kate had discharged herself from hospital. There were some initial difficulties involved in this, because first the ward sister and then the doctor in charge of Kate's case were adamant that she was in no fit state to leave. She had only just emerged from a minor coma, and she needed care, she needed pizza, insisted Kate. Rest, she needed my own home and fresh air. The air in here is horrible, it smells like a vacuum cleaner's armpit. Further medication, and should definitely remain under observation for another day or so until they were satisfied that she had made a full recovery. At least they were fairly adamant. During the course of the morning, Kate demanded and got a telephone and started trying to order pizza to be delivered to her ward. She phoned around all of the least cooperative pizza restaurants she knew in London, harangued them, then made some noisily unsuccessful attempts to muster a motorbike to roam around the West End and try and pick up for her an American hot with a list of additional peppers and mushrooms and cheeses, which the controller of the courier service refused even to attempt to remember. And after an hour or so of this sort of behaviour, the objections to Kate discharging herself from the hospital gradually fell away like petals from an autumn rose. And so, a little after lunchtime, she was standing on a bleak West London street, feeling weak and shaky, but in charge of herself. She had with her the empty, tattered remains of a garment bag, which she had refused to relinquish, and also a small scrap of paper in her purse, which had a single name scribbled on it. She hailed a taxi and sat in the back with her eyes closed most of the way back to her home in Primrose Hill. She climbed up the stairs and let herself into her top-floor flat. There were 10 messages on her answering machine, which she simply erased without listening to. She threw open the window in her bedroom, and for a moment or two leaned out of it at the rather dangerous and awkward angle which allowed her to see a patch of the park. It was a small corner patch, with just a couple of plane trees standing in it. The backs of some of the intervening houses framed it, or rather, just failed totally to obscure it, and made it very personal and private to Kate, in a way which a vast, sweeping vista would not have been. On one occasion, she had gone to this corner of the park, and walked around the invisible perimeter that marked off the limits of what she could see, and had come very close to feeling that this was her own domain. She had even patted the plane trees in a proprietorial sort of way, and had then sat beneath them, watching the sun going down over London, over its badly spoiled skyline and its non-delivering pizza restaurants, and had come away with a profound sense of something or other, though she wasn't quite certain what. Still, she had told herself, these days she should feel grateful for a profound sense of anything at all, however unspecific. She hauled herself in from the window, left it wide open in spite of the chill of the outside air, padded through into the small bathroom and ran the bath. It was a bath of the sprawling Edwardian type, which took up a wonderfully disproportionate amount of the space available, and encompassed most of the rest of the room with cream-painted pipes. The taps seethed. As soon as the room was sufficiently full of steam to be warm, Kate undressed, and then went and opened the large bathroom cupboard. She felt faintly embarrassed by the sheer profusion of things she had for putting in baths, but she was, for some reason, incapable of passing any chemist or herb shop without going in to be seduced by some glass-stoppered bottle of something blue or green or orange and oily that was supposed to restore the natural balance of some vague substance she didn't even know she was supposed to have in her pores. She paused, trying to choose. Something pink? Something with extra vitamin B, vitamin B12, B13? Just the number of things with different types of vitamin B in them was an embarrassment of choice in itself. There were powders as well as oils, tubes of gel, even packets of some kind of pungent-smelling seed that was meant to be good for some obscure part of you in some arcane way. How about some of the green crystals? One day, she had told herself in the past, she would not even bother trying to choose, but would simply put a bit of everything in, when she really felt in need of it. She rather thought that today was the day, and with a sudden reviving rush of pleasure, she set about putting a drop or two of everything in the cupboard into the seething bath, until it was confused with mingling, muddying colours and verging on the glutinous to touch. She turned off the taps, went to her handbag for a moment, then returned and lowered herself into the bath, where she lay with her eyes closed, breathing slowly for fully 3 minutes, before at last turning her attention to the scrap of paper she had brought with her from the hospital. It had one word on it, and it was a word she had dragged out of an oddly reluctant young nurse who had taken her temperature that morning. Kate had questioned her about the big man whom she had encountered at the airport, whose body she had seen in a nearby side ward in the early hours of the night. Oh no, the nurse had said, he wasn't dead, he was just in a sort of coma. Could she see him, Kate had asked? What was his name? She had tried to ask idly in passing, as it were, which was a difficult trick to pull off with a thermometer in her mouth, and she wasn't at all certain she had succeeded. The nurse had said that she couldn't really say, she wasn't really meant to talk about other patients. And anyway, the man wasn't there anymore. He'd been taken somewhere else. They had sent an ambulance to collect him and take him somewhere else. This had taken Kate considerably by surprise. Where had they taken him? What was this special place? But the nurse had been unwilling to say anything much more, and a second or two later had been summoned away by the sister. The only word the nurse had said was the one that Kate had then scribbled down on a piece of paper she was now looking at. The word was Woodshead. Now that she was more relaxed, she had a feeling that the name was familiar to her in some way, though she could not remember where she had heard it. Instant she remembered, she could not stay in the bath any longer, but got out and made straight for the telephone, pausing only briefly to shower all the gunk off her. The big man awoke and tried to look up, could hardly raise his head. He tried to sit up, couldn't do that either. He felt as if he'd been stuck to the floor with superglue, and after a few seconds he discovered the most astounding reason for this. He jerked his head up violently, yanking out great tufts of yellow hair which stayed painfully stuck to the floor, and looked around him. He was in what appeared to be a derelict warehouse, probably an upper floor judging from the wintry sky he could see creeping past the grimy, shattered windows. The ceilings were high and hung with cobwebs built by spiders who did not seem to mind that most of what they caught was crumbling plaster and dust. They were supported by pillars made from upright steel joists on which the dirty old cream paint was bubbled and flaking, and these in turn stood on a floor of battered old oak, onto which he had clearly been glued. Extending out for a foot or two in a rough oval all around his naked body, the floor glistened darkly and dully. Thin, nostril-cleaning fumes rose from it. He could not believe it. He roared with rage, tried to wriggle and shake himself, but succeeded only in tugging painfully at his skin where it was stuck fast to the oak planks. This had to be the old man's doing. He threw his head back hard against the floor in a blow that cracked the boards and made his ears sing. He roared again and took some furious satisfaction in making as much hopeless, stupid noise as he could. He roared until the steel pillars rang and the cracked remains of the windows shattered into finer shards. Then, as he threw his head angrily from one side to the other, he caught sight of his sledgehammer leaning against the wall a few feet from him, heaved it up into the air with a word, and sent it hurtling around the great space, beating and clanging on every pillar until the whole building reverberated like a mad gong. Another word, and the hammer flew back at him, missed his head by hand's width, and punched straight down through the floor, shattering the wood and the plaster below. In the darker space beneath him, the hammer spun and swung round in a slow, heavy parabola as bits of plaster fell about it and rattled on the concrete floor below. Then it gathered a violent momentum and hurtled back up through the ceiling, smacking up a stack of startled splinters as it punched through another oak floorboard a hand's width from the soles of the big man's feet. It soared up into the air, hung there for a moment as if its weight had suddenly vanished. Then, deftly flicking its short handle up above its head, it drove hard back down through the floor again, then up again, then down again, punching holes in a splintered ring around its master, until, with a long, heavy groan, the whole oval section of punctured floor gave way and plunged twisting through the air. It shattered itself against the floor below, amidst a rain of plaster debris, from which the figure of the big man then emerged staggering, flapping at the dusty air and coughing. His back, his arms, and his legs were still covered with great splintered hunks of oak flooring, but at least he was able to move. He leant the flat of his hands against the wall and violently coughed some of the dust from his lungs. As he turned back, his hammer danced out of the air towards him, then suddenly evaded his grasp and skidded joyfully off across the floor, striking sparks from the concrete with its great head, flipped up and parked itself against a nearby pillar at a jaunty angle. In front of him, the shape of a large Coca-Cola vending machine loomed through the settling cloud of dust. He regarded it with the gravest suspicion and worry. It stood there with a sort of glazed, blank look to it, and had a note from his father stuck on the front panel, saying whatever he was doing, stop it. It was signed you-know-who, but this had been crossed out, and first the word Odin, and then in large letters, your father, had been substituted. Odin never ceased to make absolutely clear his view of his son's intellectual accomplishments. The big man tore the note off and stared at it in anger. The postscript added darkly, remember Wales, you don't want to go through all that again. He screwed the note up and hurled it out of the nearest window, where the wind whipped it up and away. For a moment he thought he heard an odd squeaking noise, but it was probably just the blustering of the wind as it whistled between the nearby derelict buildings. He turned and walked to the window and stared out of it in a belligerent sulk. Glued to the floor, at his age, what the devil was that supposed to mean? Keep your head down was what he guessed. If you don't keep it down, I'll have to keep it down for you. That was what it meant. Stick to the ground. He remembered now the old man saying exactly that to him at the time of all the unpleasantness with the Phantom fighter jet. Why can't you just stick to the ground, he had said. He could imagine the old man and his soft-headed, benign malice, thinking it very funny to make the lesson so literal. Rage began to rumble menacingly inside him, but he pushed it down hard. Very worrying things had recently begun happening when he got angry, and he had a bad feeling, looking back at the Coca-Cola vending machine, that another of those very worrying things must have just happened. He stared at it and fretted. He felt ill. He'd felt ill a lot of late, and he found it impossible to discharge what were left of his godly duties, when he felt he was suffering from a sort of continual low-grade flu. He experienced headaches, dizzy spells, guilt, and all the sorts of ailments that were featured so often in television advertisements. He even suffered terrifying blackouts whenever the great rage gripped him. He always used to have such a wonderful time getting angry. Great gusts of marvelous anger would hurl him through life. He felt huge. He felt flooded with power and light and energy. He had always been provided with such wonderful things to get angry about. Immense acts of provocation or betrayal, people hiding the Atlantic Ocean in his helmet, dropping continents on him or getting drunk and pretending to be trees, stuff he could really work up a rage about and hit things. In short, he had felt good about being a thunder god. Now suddenly it was headaches, nervous tension, nameless anxieties and guilt. These were new experiences for God and not pleasant ones. You look ridiculous. The voice screeched out and affected Thor like fingernails scratched across a blackboard lodged in the back of his brain. It was a mean voice, a spiteful, jeering voice, a cheap white nylon shirt of a voice, a shiny trousered pencil moustache of a voice, in short, which Thor did not like. He reacted very badly to it at the best of times, and was particularly provoked to have to hear it while standing naked in the middle of a decrepit warehouse with large sections of an oak floor still stuck to his back. He spun round angrily. He wanted to be able to turn round calmly and with crushing dignity, but no such strategy ever worked with this creature. And since he, Thor, would only end up feeling humiliated and ridiculous whatever posture he adopted, he might as well go with one he felt comfortable with. "Toe rag!" he roared, yanked his hammer spinning into the air and hurled it with immense stunning force at the small creature who was squatting complacently in the shadows on top of a small heap of rubble, leaning forward a little. Toe rag caught the hammer and placed it neatly on top of the pile of Thor's clothes that lay next to him. He grinned and allowed a stray shaft of sunlight to glitter on one of his teeth. These things don't happen by accident. Toe rag had spent some time while Thor was unconscious, working out how long it would take him to recover, then industriously moving the pile of rubble to exactly the spot, checking the height, and then calculating the exact angle at which to lean. As a provocateur, he regarded himself as a professional. "Did you do this to me?" roared Thor. "Did you?" Thor searched for any way of saying "gloomy to the floor." It didn't sound like gloomy to the floor, but eventually the pause got too long and he had to give it up. "Gloomy to the floor?" he demanded at last. He wished he hadn't asked such a stupid question. "Don't even answer that," he added angrily, and wished he hadn't said that either. He stamped his foot and shook the foundations of the building a little just to make the point. He wasn't certain what the point was, but he felt that it had to be made. Some dust settled gently around him. Toe rag watched him with his dancing, glittering eyes. "I merely carry out the instructions given to me by your father," he said in a grotesque parody of obsequiousness. "It seems to me," said Thor, "that the instructions my father has been giving since you entered his service have been very odd. I think you have some kind of evil grip on him. Don't know what kind of evil grip it is, but it's definitely a grip, and it's definitely..." Synonyms failed him. "Evil," he concluded. Toe rag reacted like an iguana to whom someone has just complained about the wine. "Me?" he protested. "How can I possibly have a grip on your father? Odin is the greatest of the gods of Asgard, and I am his devoted servant in all things. Odin says, do this, and I do it. Odin says, go there, and I go there. Odin says, go and get my big, stupid son out of hospital before he causes any more trouble, and then, I don't know, glue him to the floor or something. And I do exactly as he asks. I am merely the most humble of functionaries. However small or menial the task, Odin's bidding is what I am there to perform." Thor was not sufficiently subtle a student of human nature, or for that matter divine or goblin nature, to be able to argue that this was in fact a very powerful grip to hold over anybody, particularly a fallible and pampered old god. He just knew that it was all wrong. "Well then," he shouted, "take this message back to my father, Odin. Tell him that I, Thor, the god of thunder, demand to meet him. And not in his damned hospital either. I'm not going to hang around reading magazines and looking at fruit while he has his bed changed. Tell him that Thor, the god of thunder, will meet Odin, the father of the gods of Asgard, tonight at the challenging hour in the halls of Asgard." "Again?" said Toe rag with a sly glance sideways at the Coca-Cola vending machine. Yes," said Thor. "Yes," he repeated in a rage. "Again." Toe rag made a tiny sigh, such as one who felt resigned to carrying out the bidding of a temperamental simpleton might make, and said, "Well, I'll tell him. I don't suppose he will be best pleased." "It's no matter of yours whether he's pleased or not," shouted Thor, disturbing the foundations of the building once more. "This is between my father and myself. You may think yourself very clever, Toe rag, and you may think that I am not." Toe rag arched an eyebrow. He had prepared for this moment, stayed silent, and merely let the stray beam of sunlight glint on his dancing eyes. It was a silence of the most profound eloquence. "I may not know what you're up to, Toe rag. I may not know a lot of things, but I do know one thing. I know that I am Thor, the god of thunder, and that I will not be made a fool of by a goblin." "Well," said Toe rag with a light grin, "when you know two things, I expect you'll be twice as clever. Remember to put your clothes on before you go out." He gestured casually at the pile beside him and departed. The trouble with the sort of shop that sells things like magnifying glasses and penknives is that they tend also to sell all kinds of other fascinating things. like the quite extraordinary device with which Dirk eventually emerged after having been hopelessly unable to decide between the knife with the built-in fillet screwdriver, toothpick and ballpoint pen, and the one with the 13-tooth gristle saw and TIG-welded rivets. The magnifying glasses had held him in thrall for a short while, particularly the 25-diopter high-index vacuum-deposited gold-coated glass model with the integral handle and mount and the notchless seal glazing. But then Dirk had happened to catch sight of a small, electronic I Ching calculator, and he was lost. He had never before even guessed at the existence of such a thing, and to be able to move from total ignorance of something to total desire for it, and then actually to own the thing all within the space of about 40 seconds, was for Dirk something of an epiphany. The electronic I Ching calculator was badly made. It had probably been manufactured in whichever of the Southeastern Asian countries was busy tooling up to do to South Korea what South Korea was busy doing to Japan. Glue technology had obviously not progressed in that country to the point where things could be successfully held together with it. Already the back had fallen off and needed to be stuck back on with Scotch tape. It was much like an ordinary pocket calculator, except that the LCD screen was a little larger than usual, in order to accommodate the abridged judgments of King Wen on each of the 64 hexagrams, and also the commentaries of his son, the Duke of Chu, on each of the lines of each hexagram. These were unusual texts to see marching across the display of a pocket calculator, particularly as they had been translated from the Chinese via the Japanese and seemed to have enjoyed many adventures on the way. The device also functioned as an ordinary calculator, but only to a limited degree. It could handle any calculation which returned an answer of anything up to 4. 1 plus 1 it could manage, 2, and 1 plus 2, 3, and 2 plus 2, 4, or tan 74, 3.4874145. With anything above 4, it represented merely as a suffusion of yellow. Dirk was not certain if this was a programming error or an insight beyond his ability to fathom. But he was crazy about it anyway, enough to hand over £20 of ready cash for the thing. "Thank you, sir," said the proprietor. "It's a nice piece, that. I think you'll be happy with it." "I am," said Dirk. "Glad to hear it, sir," replied the proprietor. "Do you know you've broken your nose?" Dirk looked up from fawning on his new possession. "Yeah," he said testily. "Of course I don't." The man nodded, satisfied. "Just that a lot of my customers wouldn't always know about a thing like that," he explained. Dirk thanked him tersely and hurried out with his purchase. A few minutes later, he took up residence at the small corner table of an Islington cafe, ordered a small but incredibly strong cup of coffee, and attempted to take stock of his day. A moment's reflection told him that he was almost certainly going to need a small but incredibly strong beer as well, and he attempted to add this to his order. "A what?" said the waiter. His hair was very black and filled with brilliantine. He was tall, incredibly fit, and too cool to listen to customers or say consonants. Dirk repeated his order, but what with having the cafe's music system, a broken nose, and the waiter's insuperable cool to contend with, he eventually found it simpler to write out the order on a napkin with a stub of pencil. The waiter peered at it in an offended manner and left. Dirk exchanged a friendly nod with the girl sitting half reading a book at the next table, who had watched this exchange with sympathy. Then he set about laying out his morning's acquisitions on the table in front of him. The newspaper, the electronic I Ching calculator, and the envelope which he had retrieved from behind the gold disc on Geoffrey Anstey's bathroom wall. He then spent a minute or two dabbing at his nose with a handkerchief and prodding it tenderly to see how much it hurt, which turned out to be quite a lot. He sighed and stuffed the handkerchief back in his pocket. A few seconds later, the waiter returned bearing a herb omelette and a single breadstick. Dirk explained that this wasn't what he'd ordered. The waiter shrugged and said it wasn't his fault. Dirk had no idea what to say to this and said so. He was still having a great deal of difficulty speaking. The waiter asked Dirk if he knew that he'd broken his nose, and Dirk said that, yes, thank you very much, he did. The waiter said that his friend Neil had once broken his nose, and Dirk said that he hoped it hurt like hell, which seemed to draw the conversation to a close. The waiter took the omelette and left, vowing never to return. When the girl sitting at the next table looked away for a moment, Dirk leaned over and took her coffee. He knew that he was perfectly safe doing this because she would simply not be able to believe that this had happened. He sat sipping at the lukewarm cup and casting his mind back over the day. He knew that before consulting the I Ching, even an electronic one, he should try and compose his thoughts and allow them to settle calmly. This was a tough one. However much he tried to clear his mind and think in a calm and collected way, he was unable to stop Geoffrey Anstey's head revolving incessantly in his mind. It revolved disapprovingly